The story begins in a dark place. The girl in the light outfit fell forward. It was a sudden betrayal. A certain stranger who was nearby grinned and spoke about that wonderful feeling, addressing Iris. She was mocking her. The girl thought that she just hated it. She understood that she did not want to die at all, and this time she wanted to live her time extremely peacefully and calmly. She was determined that this time she would definitely not give up as easily as she had last time. The sun shone incredibly brightly, striking with its rays various trees and bright flowers that were nearby. The girl, whose eyes had been closed only a moment ago, abruptly opened them. She jumped up from her seat and was amazed to find herself thinking that she was still alive. Iris thought that she was, as expected, an excellent saint. She thought about how she was betrayed first, and then she ate the monster flower, and yet, thanks to perseverance, she was still able to be reborn. Suddenly, she turned pale, thinking that her whole body was cut by magic, so she was also eaten by a monster. She rose from the flower in which she appeared, thinking that she was, of course, glad that she was saved, but she needed to get out of there as soon as possible. Suddenly she thought about it and realized that she couldn't feel her own legs. After that, she blushed a little, noticing also that she was not wearing any clothes. However, she can't do anything about it because her clothes were dissolved. After that, the girl paid attention to everything else that was happening around. She drew attention to the large object that Iris was in. The girl was confused, thinking that it all looks like in her book about monsters. Iris thought that it was definitely a flower-type monster. Iris looked around and touched the petal of the flower she was in. Suddenly, she was very surprised. She realized that she felt not only touching the flower, but also her hand. After that, the girl realized that the flower is a part of her body. She wondered if she was right. She smiled broadly and realized that, obviously, she was no longer a human being, but a flower monster. The girl looked down. Iris sighed and smiled, wanting to finally clarify the whole situation. Her name is Iris Seijo, and she was killed. The girl closed her eyes. She was the second daughter of the Duke of the Kingdom of Gardenia. Her family helped the country by using the greatest saint magic that could heal. She was 17 years old. Together with the hero, who was also the second prince, childhood friend and husband, and her other friends, they went on a journey to kill the Demon King. After a while, they almost arrived at the Demon King. But along the way, she was suddenly betrayed. There was a disciple of the saint, and next to her stood the hero, that is, Iris's husband. Not only did her husband betray her, but he also turned out to be an unpleasant person. Iris couldn't help but think that it was just terrible. At that very moment, she remembered that she had a different life. Ayame Murasaki. It looks like she was an ordinary high school student at a Japanese school. From what she remembered, the girl received neither skills nor benefits, by the way, nothing at all. She didn't know why she remembered her past lives. She also thought about the monster that ate her then. The girl thought that this might be a chance given to her by the goddess herself. Iris didn't know if it was because she had the ability to heal that she merged with the monster. Everything was confused in her memory, but there was nothing she could do. She only remembered that when she was a high school student, she was a nerd. She thought about it and decided not to dwell on it. The girl knew that in a previous life she was a high school student, and in another life she was a saint. Now she was a flower monster. She smiled eerily, choosing what she would do from now on. Suddenly, she noticed something. There was something wet around her chest that suddenly started to curl. Iris realized that it was something from the tip of her chest. She thought that it was impossible for both a high school student and a saint from the Duke's family. She wasn't that old, so she didn't have any experience either. Suddenly, some liquid flowed out of her eye, which attracted the attention of the surprised girl. She tasted this liquid and noted that it was not tears at all, but real honey. Iris noted that honey is flowing from other places. She decided to try an idea. Suddenly, she was very surprised to notice something unusual. Iris spat the liquid onto her hands, thinking that it looked like, as long as she was conscious, she could choose where she would flow from. She looked around, thinking that today would be just a great day. Now she decided to try to make honey from the tip of her tongue. She was wondering if she could do it. She immediately saw that everything had worked out. Iris thought that if she tried hard, everything would work out. She suggested that there was a way to fully return to human form. She was delighted and exclaimed that the main thing is to live and not give up, and then everything will be fine. Now Iris has decided to travel. At that moment, a monster came out of the forest, which was dripping with its own saliva. Seeing this, Iris was very surprised. It was a big bear with horns, and when she saw it, she immediately noticed that it was somehow unusual. She realized that it was a monster. It was Rabobai. His sharp claws can easily break trees, and his jaw is so strong that it can bite through a soldier's helmet. Judging by the size, Iris noted that he was still a bear cub, and it seemed that he was attracted to the sweet honey of the girl. The bear just stared at her. Iris thought that she did not want to be eaten by a bear, and even if she wanted to escape, she would not succeed, because she could not even move. Suddenly, he slowly began to approach the girl, who was already beginning to panic. She didn't want to die at all. Iris had never heard of him as a strong monster, but she had also heard that they used the honey that flowed out of her to resist the rest of the monsters and humans. She decided that she needed to fight, and her only environment was the vine. Iris simply had no other choice. She sent her vines to attack the bear. The monster tried to dodge while she thought she wanted to close the distance first and then attack. Suddenly, she felt a presence. At that moment, memories of a little girl who went fishing with her father popped into her head. Realizing something, she took a vine and began to inflate it until honey dripped from it. She swung the vine, thinking that after she immobilized the bear, she would immediately catch it. That's exactly what she did. Iris sighed, thinking that she had caught a bear that was crazy about honey. She took a deep breath. The girl watched as the monster began to drool on the vine. Because of this, she had an unpleasant feeling. The bear clung to the vine, and Iris felt the pain. Of course, she is surprised that she does not feel a strong pain, since it is still a vine. She doesn't bleed, but just transmits the pain to her. Iris suggested that it might be because of the purple dust. Suddenly, the bear fell unconscious and immediately detached himself from the vine that Iris had wrapped around him. The girl smiled, thinking that, in the end, she would have been able to cope with him without this dust. She was pleased that she was much stronger than she had previously thought. She looked at the unconscious monster and wondered what she could do with this bear now. She was in some perplexity. The girl put her hands on her body, thinking that she was not feeling very well. Iris quickly guessed and realized that she seemed to be hungry, and now she needed even more energy. She looked at the bear and thought that her instinct for self-preservation suggests that she should eat this bear properly. She looked around, although her whole face was already sweating with emotion she didn't understand. The girl understood that, given that she used to be a human, she simply couldn't do it, although she also had contradictions related to her new identity. The next moment, the bear's entire body appeared in a flower, from which Iris's torso grew. The girl smiled, thinking that it was quite good. She apologized to that bear. Iris had the distinct feeling that she had drunk a bear-flavored drink rather than eaten it recently. This reminded the girl of the fact that she is no longer the same person she was before she was reborn into a monster. In this form, she could no longer show herself to either her father or mother, and if she met the hero and his students, she would not be able to withstand ridicule and preserve her pride. Since the girl's heart was broken, she wanted to take revenge on him, and, moreover, the saint's training was difficult, so she thought that if they defeated the Demon King, then she would be free from all this. She was also proud that she was the wife of a hero, a prince, and spent the rest of her life peacefully. Perhaps she would have been able to take care of him and leave a decent legacy. If they had a child, he could either become a king or like her. A picture of herself appeared in Iris's head, sitting at the window with her child with a wide smile and enjoying life. The girl still could not accept the fact that now she is not the same as she was, and in fact is the most ordinary flower monster. She hid in the red petals for the night, and at the first rays of the sun, the flower began to move. It slowly opened, and a little girl's head appeared there. Iris noted that she now feeds on water and sunlight. The girl stretched herself well, thinking that she needed very little in order to live a good life. While the monsters were chasing the bees, Iris only thought that she wanted to live a modest life, like an ordinary plant. She wanted to become a kind of indoor flower, living quietly and gracefully, because now she is just a huge flower monster. This was the beginning of her new path. Iris was an ordinary high school student at first, then she was reborn in this world as a saint. In this time, she took a new path as a plant monster. The girl could not even imagine that such a thing would happen. The girl thought that there was nothing to be afraid of here, because she was just an ordinary, beautiful flower. There is no one in the forest except the girl, only monsters and animals that do not understand the language. Iris sat contentedly in her flower and thought about how she had so much free time. For this reason, she decided to explore her own characteristics. This is the Arlen plant. The girl had heard about him when she was still Iris. She had read about it in her book of plants, but it was a fiction. A mandrake from the Solanaceae species. In fiction, she is known for making terrible screams when she is pulled out of the ground. It is also used as a magical material. Iris thought about the fact that she personally believes that Arlaune is a relative of the mandrake. She suddenly realized that this meant that she was also a nightshade. Nightshade species are supposed to be amphoteric plants, but the girl has neither stamens nor pistil. The plant that became a female-type flower as a result of the degeneration of the stamen and the evolution of the pistil is the iris. She had no doubt that her gender was female. The girl thought that, in principle, the process of giving birth to her children would be almost like that of humans. She was wondering if she would get pregnant if she was pollinated like an ordinary plant. Iris, with a lost expression on her face, thought about what would happen to herself then. The girl was familiar with such plants when she was still a high school student. She used to love anime and manga. Iris was a so-called otaku. Iris was thinking about her past and herself. She thought about how she really enjoyed reading books back then. Most of these books were illustrative. Among all the girls, botany was the most interesting. Iris remembered that all she did at school was spend time reading books. She thought of herself as a little girl. Iris was someone who really liked plants. At that moment, a gentle wind blew. Something caught the girl's attention. She looked closer and saw an insect flying towards her. Iris noticed that it was a bee called oranbine. The girl also thought that it looked like she was the size of a human. The girl thought that she hates insects because they bite painfully. However, it doesn't matter now because Iris is no longer human. Iris realized that she is now a flower, and it is quite natural when bees come in search of nectar. The girl suddenly thought about the fact that if we talk about bees, they seem to pollinate. Bees transfer pollen when collecting nectar, when they fly from flower to flower, as this is the only way to pollinate flowers. This is called entomophilia, which is usually used by farmers to breed different varieties of fruits. Iris thought with a smile that, in other words, it could be said that bees pollinate involuntarily. She held out her hands to the bee with the thought that her time had come. The girl looked at the bee and thought how fast the pollination would be. She suddenly froze and thought that this was no longer a joke. The girl did not want to be pollinated by an unknown male-type flower. She asked the bee not to approach her. Iris screamed in her mind that she was actually not that simple. Meanwhile, the bee was advancing. The girl got ready, thinking that it didn't matter, because she would fight for her chastity. By this point, the bee was already quite close to the girl, who had prepared a sprout for protection. Iris looked at the bee with a serious expression on her face, and her vine threw her forward. The long plant tried to wrap itself around the bee, but it dodged. The girl thought that the bee was pretty fast. In a few moments, a huge bee appeared in front of the girl, which made Iris very surprised. The bee greeted the girl with a grin. Iris waved her arms and shouted for the bee to taste the girl's poisonous pollen. This maneuver caused the bee to freeze for a short time, but nothing else happened. Iris suggested that she must be resistant to poisons. Suddenly, Iris remembered something. The girl thought that she had been a saint in her previous life. The girl suggested that what if she could use her holy magic in this life as well? Iris quickly stretched out her hand to use her arrow of light magic. However, there was no reaction. She wondered what about the restoration magic then. She touched the vine, which reacted to her recovery magic. The girl was surprised that the vine began to grow. Iris suggested that it might be because she has holy magic. She thought that it seemed that this magic, interacting with the vine, only increases its growth and does not restore it. The girl thought with a smile that now, with the help of this, she would definitely be able to win. Iris looked closely at the huge bee that was flying towards her. The girl's vine headed towards the bee, which deftly dodged. At that moment, Iris noticed something, so she used recovery magic. Her vine approached the bee, and at that moment, Iris thought that now she needed to be stretched. The plant caught the bee's wing at that moment. The insect surprisingly began to lose its balance right in the air. Iris noticed this and thought that now was the right moment. The girl's vine instantly wrapped around the bee's body from all sides. After that, she fell to the ground in front of the flower. The girl looked at the bee with a big smile on her face. She happily thought that she had won. Everything is as she thought. At that moment, a large number of bees appeared next to the girl, who were looking at the girl. Iris thought with a smile that this simply could not be. Iris began to be called Mom and called. The girl imagined how she was surrounded by many small flowers, which were also called her mother. They ask who their father is. Iris would have replied with a smile that their father is a plant that no one knows. She screamed in her mind. The girl screamed, saying that it would be just disgusting. Her vines moved quickly. Also, those vines that were under the flower began to rise. They quickly enveloped the flower, protecting it from bees. Iris thought that right now she needed to concentrate on protecting herself and be on her guard. Iris hid under a thick layer of vines, thinking that she had to protect her chastity. The huge bees continued to circle next to the flower, which was covered with long vines. It gradually became dark outside, and night fell. Iris, surrounded by bees, thought about how long they would still fly near her. She hoped that in a few hours it would stop. She asked haggardly for the bees to give up already and fly away. However, the insects continued to circle the flower. Iris sighed wearily, cursing inwardly. The girl was thirsty. She needed water. In addition, the vine began to wither, and magic could not work forever. Iris thought that she wasn't sure she could win if she started fighting. However, the girl couldn't do it anymore. She thought that if even one of the bees touched the vine, it would collapse. Iris couldn't beat them all. The girl did not know what to do then. The bees continued to circle nearby, and the girl began to think. She noticed that the bee touched the honey first. Iris realized something at that moment. She quickly began to smear the tips of the vine with honey from her mouth. The girl began to throw aside the vines with honey, thinking that it turns out that the bees were attracted by her honey. The insects quickly flocked to the sweetness in front of them. Iris was very surprised because the bees ate more honey than she thought. She suddenly thought of what she could do. She thought that was true. Since bees want honey so much, the girl thought that maybe she could just give it to them, and then maybe they would leave her alone later. Iris waved her arms, sending even more vines wrapped in sweet honey to the sides. Bees began to gather at their place and eat honey. The girl continued to dip the tips of the vines into her mouth to cover them with honey. One by one, the girl sent doses to the bees. Iris fell wearily on her back and wondered if they really liked her honey so much. The girl sighed, talking about how tired she was. She really wanted water, so she hoped it would rain. Iris closed her eyes, thinking about what it was like. The girl fell asleep and woke up only the next morning opening her petals. She knew that there are several types of these bees, and yesterday it was the morning pickers. She lay there thinking that she would never have thought that she would meet them so soon. Besides, she had no other choice. Iris just needs to accept that someone might pollinate her. The girl looked up wearily, apologizing to the bees for not understanding them. However, she had a feeling that they were asking for more honey. Iris thought about how tired she was after everything. Even her rose petals had withered a little, and even the mouth at the bottom of the bulb was not in the best condition. Iris folded her hands in front of her and sincerely asked the bees to come home already. The insects looked at the girl, then turned around and flew away. The girl looked after them in surprise, thinking that they might have been called, so they flew into the depths of the forest. She assumed that was what saved her. Iris was about to exhale with relief, but bees appeared on the horizon again, carrying something with them. She nodded wearily, saying that they were early because she hadn't recovered yet. For this reason, the girl said that she did not have honey. Suddenly, she saw the carcass of a wild boar nearby. Iris looked hopefully at the bees, asking them if they had really brought this for her. The girl thought that, instead of squeezing honey out of her as a potential enemy, the bees decided to be friendly with her. There are several bees circling around her now, so Iris assumed they were protecting her. The girl thought that they looked like knights who were defending their princess. Iris waved her hands with a joyful smile, saying that she would be the first friend for bees as a plant. The girl decided that in the future she would create her own paradise, and today was the first step towards this. She thought that surrounded by animals and monsters that love her, she would live as a plant and lead a peaceful life. On a clear day, a bird with very beautiful feathers flew right over the forest. Suddenly, she noticed something unusual and immediately stopped. At the same time, a bunch of monsters that looked like monkeys gathered in one place and were ready to attack. Iris waved her hand and sent an army of bees against the monsters. At the same moment, the little creatures rushed to attack the monkeys, who were holding weapons in their hands and were ready to kill. After a while, the battle was over. A group of 12 barbicans. They didn't stand a chance against an army of 100 Zorbans. The victory was overwhelming. But even so, the bees suffered some losses. The girl told them that they should not worry because she would save them from pain. The monsters were walking straight towards the girl. They all looked at her while she smiled awkwardly. The girl understood that these bees were not angry with her. even if she ate their fallen comrades. She wondered if they really only cared about nectar. Suddenly, she gasped. She noted that everything happened yesterday when she defeated the errant Barbaphone. It was for this reason that a whole bunch came to her today, wanting to take revenge on her. She noted that it was then that she decided to signal for help by extending one of her tentacles to the sky. Then, out of nowhere, countless bees flew in. They feed her and act like bodyguards in exchange for her nectar. It made Iris feel like a celebrity. After that, she thought about the fact that all the workers there were female. The girl suggested that she might have accidentally joined a women's love club. The girl smiled sweetly, thinking that since this is a club, they will call themselves forest lilies. After her gaze fell on the dead monkey next to her, she sighed, thinking that it would be better if these monsters stopped disturbing her peace because it was already bothering her. It seemed to her that these monkeys were quite intelligent, and for some reason they even had weapons. To be honest, Iris thought it was dangerous. Suddenly, she heard an animal picking something up with its beak. Iris turned around and saw a small bird eating something from the floor. The animal raised its gaze, and Iris saw an incredibly beautiful bird, which, in turn, also looked at the girl. Iris was surprised and noted that she had never seen this bird before. She was struck by how white the animal was, as if it had been dipped in paint. She wanted to taste the bird and stretched out her tentacles, but the animal quickly dodged and flew high into the sky. Iris silently looked at the bird and sighed, thinking that, in that case, she would not try it next time. The bird flew away. The bees were collecting something. Iris wondered what these insects would do to these monkeys. The girl decided that, most likely, they would have a big family dinner. It sounded extremely sweet to her. After that, she thought that the girl would eat alone as usual. That night, she woke up and looked up at the sky. She didn't understand why she was so hot. The girl saw that something rather bright and shapeless was floating in the air, like a burning plane. It was wonderful. After that, she gasped in surprise and yawned, muttering something. She hid in a flower and fell asleep again. And the next day, her forest life turned into a nightmare. Everything around her was completely dry. It happened so suddenly that Iris didn't even have time to react properly. The girl was sweating profusely, trying to figure out what was wrong with the weather and why she was so hot. She would like it to rain, because she really needs water. She tried her best to put her roots deeper underground, but was able to collect only a couple of drops of water. In desperation, she began to gather herbs around her, and since they did not wither, it means that there must still be water inside them. It seemed to her that the bees realized that she had problems with water and therefore temporarily stopped coming to her for nectar. And so she spent her days waiting for rain, but the drought continued, and at some point, she reached her limit. The girl was convulsing and begging for rain to survive. She thought that if she had known that this would happen, she would have learned a couple of prayers about calling the rain in her previous life. She only asked God to give her rain. Suddenly, she gasped, noticing the same white bird next to her. Iris thought about how she had been seeing more of her lately. The bird was doing well, because it could soar freely in the sky. When they feel thirsty, they can easily fly to another place where there is water. She would like to live like a bird. Suddenly, the animal looked attentively at Iris, which made the girl tense up. She just stared back at the bird. Iris wondered if the creature had come to fight her. She thought about how the bird liked to watch her torment. She wondered what would happen to the animal if she ate it, because it would give her at least some water. Suddenly, the bird soared into the sky, and a couple of drops of water fell from its wings on Iris, which greatly surprised the girl. She gasped as she realized the fact that the bird seemed to have flown to her after bathing. Iris looked at her hands, thinking that although there was not much water, she was still very grateful to the animal. She decided that, in gratitude for the water, she would not eat the animal yet. She was spared the worst, but that wasn't enough, because she needed even more water. After a long week, her prayers were finally answered. As on the day before the drought began, something bright flew over her. In a bright flash, it brought cloudy weather. He flew towards the demonic domain. She realized that this was a mountainous area where the followers of the demon lord lived. She thought about it. Neither the lord nor the fact that these mountains were supposed to be her next destination help her in any way now. It had nothing to do with her anymore because, after all, it's not the concern of such a pathetic plant. She was very curious about what kind of flying thing it was, but alas, she could not find out in any way. Instead, she focused on the storm clouds she hadn't seen in a month. Its petals drooped and its leaves cracked. Now, her vascular bundles were just roaring in terrible pain. She raised her hand to the sky and began to ask something higher to make it rain. The next moment, water began to drip from the sky. Iris smiled broadly and spread her arms, taking in all the water. Everything around bloomed. When the girl felt better, the bees returned to her. It was the best day for Iris. She felt like an all-powerful honey princess, but she couldn't keep basking in the glory because the bees had brought another creature to her. It growled loudly. Iris just looked at him in silence, after which she awkwardly greeted him, also asking the bees not to leave them alone. The monster hissed at her, and Iris felt fear. The girl wondered if the bees were collecting nectar from this ogre, and if this was payback for not giving them nectar. She wondered if she wasn't enough for them. However, she had an emergency then. This creature seemed hostile, but they were both plants, so Iris hoped that they would become friends. She greeted and wanted to offer friendship, but the plant was bitten by an iris tentacle, which made the girl seriously angry. She picked it up and was about to eat it. Iris was thinking that there could only be one princess in the forest. It was then that her body began to change. Now she has decided to direct the restoration magic to her vines. The girl was surprised to notice something unusual. Now she could grow cannibal flowers from her vines. Then she plucked a nearby plant with yellow flowers and ate it. Immediately after that, sprouts were started on it. She didn't know how it worked, but apparently, whenever she eats a plant or a monster like her, she can grow it. She called such an unusual, but very charming process a floral creation. The monster continued to eat plants. Iris ate all the nearby plants of different species because no one knows what will happen in the future. They can never be prepared for everything. But then her peaceful days were interrupted again, and this time it was what she feared the most. A man fell in front of her. Iris was very surprised. She couldn't believe that there was still a living person right in front of her. Someone was running through the forest, remembering the man's words that he would be gone for a while. The grandfather told the child that he should not miss training. The man was apologizing for running away. Panting, he ran, wanting to be saved. At this time, a bunch of bees were chasing him, pressing him closer to the edge. They wounded a man with their sting, and he screamed loudly. Iris was surprised. She looked at the child and thought about what she could do to him. She understood that this child looked about 10 years old. After that, she noticed that he was still breathing. It was an offering from bees today, but Iris would not prefer to eat a human. With her tentacles, she gently lifted the child into her arms. Iris stroked his head, noticing that he was injured. The girl thought that the child would be fine if she neutralized the poison. She wanted to use restorative magic, but quickly realized that she could only use it on herself. At the same moment, a different decision came to her. She thought that if she could collect nectar in her mouth and put restoration magic on her, it would help. She poured the liquid into the baby's mouth, and he immediately woke up. He looked around, asking where he was. Iris was glad that he got up. In fact, she did not expect that her nectar could be used as medicine. Suddenly, the boy noticed Iris's body and shouted loudly that she was a monster. She stopped him from falling, wanting to be heard. She thought she could say it, but she didn't know exactly how. It was difficult for her because her voice is a little worse than people's. The boy was confused when he noticed that she could speak a human language, because he had never met such a thing. Iris struggled to collect her thoughts. She said she wasn't a monster, and he could call her sis. The boy was shocked, after which his gaze fell on her breasts. He immediately blushed and turned away. And then Iris remembered that Alraunes have a seductive skill, rather pheromones, which, in combination with a woman's appearance, can seduce any man. Luring a man like that would be awkward, but if it was a child, it was different. She wondered if it would work on him. The girl hugged him tightly, thinking that she was in a great mood right now. The boy blushed, and then told his sister that she smelled very sweet and pleasant. She looked at him with a smile, then spat out more nectar. The boy turned pale with horror. Iris knew it looked disgusting, but he didn't have to worry about that part. She handed him the liquid. The boy carefully tasted the nectar. Iris asked heavily what kind of place it was. The boy was confused, and the girl clarified what she was saying about the country. When he understood what she meant, he told her that this was the border between the Kingdom of Cordinia and the Clanes Empire. It was about what she expected. Iris found herself at the place where her adventure ended. She asked what year it was, and he explained that it was the 1020th year of the Tensei calendar. Iris was very surprised that 3 years had passed since then. It's been a few months since she woke up in Alraune, which means it took about 2 years for their bodies to fuse together. She bombarded the boy with questions, and he politely answered each one. She was asking if someone had died here 3 years ago, and if the Demon King had been defeated. She also wondered what the Gardenia hero was doing. She also asked about the bride of the hero, about herself. The child also said that he does not live here but just passed by, so he does not know about the events of such a long time ago. He didn't know anyone named Iris, but he knew a saint who married a hero. The demon lord is still not defeated, and a child has also heard that the saint does not allow the hero to go, but the boy thinks that the hero should go and do his duty. Iris was angry when she realized that the new girl had married him, but it was only because of her wealth, and now she is lounging in the palace. Now she wanted to get into the royal garden and take revenge at the first opportunity. Iris immediately thought that she had very beautiful legs. The boy was confused and asked if he could leave, but Iris clung to him with tentacles. She said he would stay. Oh, it was a lot of fun talking to people, and she couldn't let the baby go. She gave him more nectar. When he asked for more, she gave more. It went on like this until he wanted it for the rest of his life. Then she spent 3 days instilling in him an addiction to her nectar. The boy wanted more nectar. This boy begging for nectar was named Armen. His parents were killed by demons. He travels with his grandfather, who is a powerful magician. However, Armen is not coping with his training. That's why he ran away as soon as his grandfather went to another village to destroy demons. Then he was attacked by bees and brought to her. It was unusual. Iris also understood why she could speak. The fact that she ate the man-eating plant the other day helped her. This plant could make all kinds of sounds, and it came out very well. She also noticed that the boy had a ring fruit in his bag. It looked delicious. By eating fruits and acquiring their skills, Iris learned to grow them on herself, but her nectar would be enough. She thought that the boy was probably glad that she missed having fun, because if it wasn't for that reason, she would have eaten him long ago. She wanted him to live on. The girl woke Armen up and said that they would train his magic. If he had undergone rigorous training, he would have been strong. Iris believed that he must have talent. Armen exclaimed that he did not want to, but Iris said that if he did not train, he would regret it, because someday his magic would be able to protect him. The boy looked at her and asked if she could use magic. Iris said it wasn't like that, but she knows how to do it. After saying that she would give nectar for training, Armen immediately agreed, and so the day came. She told him to concentrate the mana at one point, and then convert it into an element, and then throw it as a spell. Armen did everything right. He created a light breeze, and Iris wondered what kind of pose it was. The girl said that he had accumulated mana incorrectly because he should be able to use more powerful magic. Iris said that he shouldn't rush, but instead imagine that his mana flow is at one point. He tried and asked if it would be enough, but Iris asked for even more. She stated that it is important to know your limit. Iris added that he should accumulate and then abruptly release. After that, he created a huge stream of wind. Iris told him to repeat it because he would succeed. The boy was very happy. He fell to the ground and sighed. Armen saw a bird in the sky and said it was Grandpa's wind magic. If he is not mistaken, then he can transform the air into a bird and control it. Everything that this bird sees, he sees too. Those were grandfather's words. Iris noticed that he had a high level of magic. After that, she realized that if his grandfather could do such magic, then if he discovered it, he would have already destroyed it. Iris told Armen to go back to the village and forget about her, keeping it a secret. The boy was surprised and said he didn't want to. He asked how he would survive without her nectar. The girl was surprised that Armen liked him, after which she thought that the boy was like that cute bear. She assumed that if she gave him something delicious, he would come home. She decided to prepare a special nectar by condensing it in her body, and then, applying restoration magic on it, turned it into a solid ball. Armen exclaimed that he would leave if she made him more. It was very sweet. After Armen got another one, he said goodbye and left. He said goodbye to his sister and said he was leaving. Iris was silently waving at him with a smile on her face. After that, she sighed, feeling nostalgic for this human warmth, because she had once been a human. Armen is going to connect with his grandfather, and he will probably leave this place in a couple of days. The nectar should last him a long time. Iris wondered what would happen after that, but decided that she shouldn't care, because they would never meet again anyway. After Armen left, 10 days passed, and then a terrifying monster appeared. On this day, someone in the village thanked Mr. Offred. The man told the old man that he, the great sage, had traveled such a long way to their village, and that was it. Offred said that everything was fine, and it was his fault, because he had to destroy all the monsters in general. The old man put his hat on his head and went to the exit. The owner of this place pushed the girl and told Ruth not to be silent, but to say goodbye. The girl lowered her hood and showed her face. She looked very modest. Offred thought about the unfortunate fate of this girl. She lost both her parents to monsters, and she's probably the same age as Armen. The girl was silent. He squatted down and told the girl that it was good to show interest in monsters, of course, but the forest was dangerous, so she should be careful. The man said that the other day, the girl asked him if there were monsters whose upper part was the girl's body and the lower part was plants. Anyway, he put up a barrier around the village, and now the monsters won't approach them. From that moment on, they could be calm. You could see the admiration in Ruth. Armen was outside at the time. He used his finger to make the leaf flutter next to him. Offred left the building and told the boy that it was time to go. While they were walking home, Offred said that earlier he had been informed that a dragon had appeared in the mountains, and therefore they would go there. Armen happily agreed to go there. The man looked at the boy and noticed that he had become more energetic. Offred wondered what had happened because the child was not telling him. He also remembered the words that barbaphones usually do not approach villages. They are so smart that they can use adventurer weapons. These monsters are quite sociable among themselves and, naturally, they really don't like it when their friends are killed. However, something disturbed the peace of these creatures, and they had to leave. It only meant that something serious had happened in the forest. At that time, someone was watching them. The little girl was looking at them. She was very interested to find out if the Alraunes were really as scary as everyone said they were. About a week after the boy left, Alraune watched in silence. This Hylian wolf beast appeared in front of her. A wolf-like beast from hell, that's exactly what adventurers call it. This is a monster that everyone is afraid of. When Iris saw him, she immediately realized that he was on a completely different level than other monsters. Because of this, she was very scared. Hylian wolf slowly began to approach Iris, who was just looking at him. The monster was grinning at her until she didn't know what to do. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind sounded through the forest. Immediately after that, the monster turned around and walked back, and Iris watched him go. She assumed it must be the king of the forest, or else she just thought so. Suddenly, terrifying sounds rang through the forest. Iris looked up at the sky in amazement. She wondered what kind of sounds they were. The girl understood that they were getting closer to her. Suddenly, she gasped and was surprised to notice something. Amid loud screams, Hylian wolf fell dead in front of her. A creature of incredible size was moving straight towards Iris. Because of its size, trees fell and the ground shook. This creature growled loudly, and Iris felt the most real horror. The girl didn't know what to do. It was Laubar. He was over 10 meters tall. Iris thought about the fact that that bear was only about 2 years old. She understood that he was a baby, but she could not imagine that an adult was so huge. The bear clung to the carcass of one of their slain monsters and began to eat it. He licked his lips well, after which his gaze fell on Iris. The girl smiled sweetly and greeted the huge bear. She wondered if he was the father of that baby, and if she should call him Mr. Father. She asked if the bear was missing, and then added that it was sad. Of course, she didn't know where he was, and she wasn't responsible. When the bear saw the girl, he was suddenly very surprised. Iris decided that she would quickly give the signal for the bees to help her. She stretched her tentacle high into the sky. The bear continued to walk slowly towards her. Iris thought it was strange that there were no bees yet, because they usually arrive right away. At that moment, one bee appeared behind the monster, and Iris wondered why it was only one. The bear instantly turned to this bee, losing attention to Iris. He swung and won with a single blow. The girl felt terrified. She saw that there were many bodies of dead bees on the back of the monster. She couldn't believe that all the bees had been killed, because she had only recently made friends with them. All her lovely allies were defeated. Iris really wanted to escape, but it wouldn't work because she's a plant. If she has a chance, she needs to come up with something. She came to the conclusion that she needed a surprise attack. She created many man-eating flowers on herself, intending to bite into the monster. They all rushed at the bear, but it didn't work. After that, she tried to turn her vines into pieces of wood. She attacked the monster with all of these. However, it took no damage. Iris thought he was too strong, but she had the advantage. She knew it would definitely work. She threw a huge cloud of purple dust at the monster. He took a breath, then sneezed violently. Iris was surprised that this was the maximum she had achieved. She thought about how she should increase her combat power even more. The girl assumed that that crimson mist should definitely deal with this monster. Suddenly, something terrible happened. Iris froze, trying to figure out what had happened downstairs. She looked closer and saw that there was a huge wound on her. This monster tore out a tree and hurled it at her like a spear. There was now a hole in the lower part of her body, and digestive fluid was gradually flowing out. She felt terrible pain. The girl decided that she would try to close the wound with the help of restoration magic. Iris was pleased to see that it worked. The fog that hung around began to slowly dissipate, and Iris saw that a huge monster was standing right next to her. He growled loudly, but Iris froze, unable to say anything. At that very moment, honey flowed from her mouth, and the monster stretched out its tongue to the girl. The next moment, he licked her face, and then her head and entire body. Iris was very scared, so she didn't even move. When the bear finished, Iris was very surprised to realize that he had come to her for the sake of nectar. It was incredibly annoying for her. Suddenly, he grabbed onto the girl's flower and tore it out of the ground. He picked up the iris along with the root and licked his lips again, intending to take it away from this place. The girl was in such shock that she couldn't even figure out if this was really happening, but she wasn't going to die. At that moment, it began to darken in Iris's eyes, and her last thoughts were that she did not want to die. The girl wanted to grow even more. She didn't want to think about it at all, because she wanted to make friends and leave her seeds in this world. She wanted so much to spend her life as a plant. She closed her eyes and smiled, realizing that everything was right, and she absolutely did not want to die now. At the same moment, large cannibal flowers grew out of her vines, which very quickly clung to the ground, stopping the bear. This angered the monster quite a lot. The girl smiled, thinking that it was too early for her to die, and, if necessary, she would just fight as a plant. 3 years have passed since then. I could hear someone running fast down the road. Armen stopped to catch his breath. The boy was able to escape. His grandfather was already quite old, so it would take him a few days to catch up with the boy. The boy was breathing heavily and thinking that he would go to that forest again. He decided that he would find Alraune again. He was determined, thinking that then he would ask her to make him more nectar pills. It was the year 200 according to the Tensei calendar, and a lot has happened since then. They had such a severe snowstorm, which happens once in a century. Some cities near the front line of the kingdom of Cardania were captured by the army of the Demon King. In addition, some witch was added to the list of wanted by the Gland's empire. It was obvious that she had escaped to Cardania, so she even sent a whole squad to find her. Armen looked carefully at the paper in his hands and thought that he was wondering what was wrong with that witch. He reflected that whatever it was, he had also changed since that day. The boy imagined Iris and thought that his whole life was based on the nectar of a girl. This nectar became Armen's food, family, first love, past, future, and everything else. Because of this, even the most rigorous training seemed very pleasant to him. And when it seemed to him that the pills were about to dissolve, it turned out that Armen could also use recovery magic. It was light magic, so usually it can only be used by saints who receive divine blessings. However, somehow, the boy managed to do it. Now that the boy thinks about it, these pills really have the magic of light. To replenish the supply of nectar pills, Armen must train the magic of light. He thought it was all for the sake of nectar. Armen thought that it was only because of this that the pills in his stomach did not completely clear up. However, there was something else. The boy, with a befuddled expression on his face, was thinking that he needed nectar. He wanted to taste that taste on his tongue again. The boy wanted this bliss to flow down his throat. He ran on with thoughts of the girl. Later, this one young man with the magic of light would become the great sage of the entire continent, but that's another story. When Armen went to that forest, he was full of hope, but everything turned out completely differently. He stood in the middle of the wasteland, just as lost. What awaited him there was an endless, impenetrable black land. There was nothing there. The boy was looking at that forest that had completely disappeared from the face of the earth. Alraune was nowhere to be seen. She too had disappeared. A small bird was sitting on a bush and pecking at its leaves when suddenly a small vine wrapped around it. The little creature was greatly surprised that such an unexpected attack had occurred on him. Under the rays of the bright sun, there was a large flower of bright color in which a small iris was sleeping peacefully at that time. Alraune thought that she wanted to live a quiet life, like a very ordinary plant. At that very moment, she suddenly had memories of the time when she became one with him. Bright splashes of blood flew in all directions on that terrifying day. The girl screamed loudly in pain, thinking that she did not want to die at all. Iris looked at the two people who were once extremely close to her and thought that she did not want to die so early. At the last moment, the girl who felt despair stretched out her hand, and a vine of a small plant reached out to her. At that very moment, their desires coincided because they both wanted to survive no matter what. With an angry cry, Lauber grabbed the plant and began to pull it out of the ground by the roots, while Iris held on to the ground with all her might, using cannibal flowers. Alraune looked at him with complete confidence, while sweat dripped from her face. Then she let her vines out to the sides. The man-eating flowers quickly dug into the ground and stopped the bear's movement. She thought about the fact that her taproot is still underground, and it is the foundation for her body, and it is also her lifeline. With the help of vines, Iris hugged her body, and man-eating flowers clung to the ground. That's how she was able to fix her body. The wild monster was still holding on to the flower, trying to take her with him, while the girl was thinking that she would not let him leave so easily. Iris easily raised her hands, which were quickly followed by flowers. At that moment, the enraged bear swung its paw to strike. His whole face was covered in his own saliva as he longed more and more to drink the nectar of Iris. Labar hit the ground next to the girl, causing the ground to scatter in different directions. Iris covered herself with her hands in shock so that no fragments would fly into her and she would not get hurt. She looked at the monster, and then at the earth, completely destroyed into small pieces, and then she thought that if he had hit her with this blow, then everything would have been over for her. Alraune decided that until he understood what was going on around him, she would continue to attack his eyes so that he could not see where to hit. Along with this decision, she sent even more of her flowers to attack the monster. Suddenly, Labar sneezed loudly. A large amount of liquid immediately flowed out of his nose, and he temporarily lost the ability to do anything. He began to wipe his nose while the girl looked at him in surprise. Iris froze. Iris couldn't understand what was happening to him. The girl saw that the monster was obviously feeling unwell, but she could not find any reason for this. Suddenly it dawned on her. She thought that if she looked closely, she could see that his arm was injured. However, it wasn't the girl who hurt him. Iris assumed it was from fighting with others. Alraune understood what was going on. Her pollen, although it could not cause any damage to him, but the bees could. The girl decided that since the bear is physically strong, it means he spends a lot of energy on it. For this reason, she decided to start an endurance battle. At that moment, the bear crouched down next to the flower and gently hugged it with his hands, which was why Iris was at a loss. The bear licked his lips. Laubar approached the girl and opened his mouth wide. The girl immediately became very confused and froze in bewilderment and shock. The monster suddenly started licking Iris, which made Alraune even more surprised at that moment. Alraune realized that he had finally stopped trying to pull it out, and decided to enjoy the nectar that was flowing out of the girl's mouth. Iris wasn't sure about this theory and then released a small amount of nectar from her mouth to test. The bear licked the girl's face again. Iris thought she wouldn't let him do whatever he wanted. She decided she had to turn his attention to something else. She gathered herself and began to think hard about what could be more attractive than her nectar. At that very moment, she opened her eyes wide because she had an idea. She took a deep breath, realizing this. Iris lowered her hands to her stomach, then raised them back closer to her face. She closed her eyes and concentrated, gathering more of her strength. The girl was thinking that if this fails, then most likely she will be finished. However, she should at least try, because her plan is perfect. The bear was still sitting in front of her with his tongue hanging out. Labar licked his lips contentedly. The girl suddenly opened her eyes in great surprise. She noticed that the bear's behavior had changed. Iris only needed to concentrate. However, at that moment, Labar stretched out his paw to her, with which Iris opened her mouth wide. The girl was confused by this behavior of the monster. The bear began to approach the girl's face with its tongue sticking out, which made Iris swear, trying to quickly come up with a strategy for the next action and the possibility of her own survival. Alraune exclaimed that she had no more time. At that moment, the vine quickly flew into her mouth. This action really helped Iris because the bear was surprised and stopped for a moment. The girl thought that she would complete her nectar pill plan. The vine picked up a small pill. Iris thought that this was not just a nectar pill, but a slightly enhanced one. Inside, it is thicker and sweeter than usual. And it also contains more powerful recovery magic. As soon as someone tries it, they will feel like they are in paradise. Labar smelled the pill, which made him close his eyes and immediately calm down, fascinated by this fragrance. Saliva began to flow profusely from his mouth. Iris noticed that this bear seemed to have noticed the charm of the pill. She took her aside so that he could look at her. This nectar pill can heal any wound, as well as restore most of both magical and physical strength. Alraune attracted Labar's attention with a pill, after which she began to move away from the monster. The bear, fascinated, began to move after her. He suddenly stopped and looked at the flower with the girl. However, he quickly turned away and moved to get the pill that the vine was holding. Iris was watching him intently. She was relieved to think that the monster had finally left her alone. She was glad, but she still did not take her eyes off and continued her observation of the enemy. Alraune looked at him carefully, thinking that since he wanted it so much, she would give it to him. After that, the girl threw the pill aside. She flew into the sky with all her speed. The cherished pill went flying while Iris screamed for the bear to catch it. The monster's attention immediately shifted to the pill, which was already high in the sky and shone beautifully, attracting his attention more and more. The recovery ball flew high into the air, sparkling along the way. At that moment, Alraune froze in shock. She looked up with a shocked face. The girl did not expect at all what happened at this very moment. A large white bird that was flying nearby picked up the pill and began to fly away. Previously, the girl had already met this particular bird, but she did not expect that everything would happen again in such circumstances. Iris was shocked to think about what this white bird was doing in general. Alraune turned pale from the shock and the way things unfolded in front of her. The girl couldn't understand why this bird appeared right now. She exclaimed the question of where she came from at all, because only a couple of moments ago this bird was not there. Iris reflected that she would not have enough time to create another pill. The girl decided that it was over. She was well aware of the fact that if this bird ate the pill, she would be the bear's target again. At that moment, the white bird began to turn around and descend. Iris looked at her in surprise, not understanding at all what this animal was doing. The bird began to fly around the puzzled bear, deliberately attracting his attention, after which it flew high into the sky again and went as far as it could fly away. Iris watched in amazement as the bird moved away. The bear slowly shifted his gaze and looked at Iris, who shuddered from the pressure that this monster created. All she wanted was for him to stop and not look at her that way. However, Labar turned around and quickly ran deep into the forest, leaving the girl alone. Iris silently watched as the bear moved further away from her, doing nothing about it. Alraune breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that she was saved. The girl was glad that he was gone, because this bear had completely licked her face. After that, Iris lay down exhausted on the flower under her and closed her eyes, trying to catch her breath and understand everything that had happened. However, Iris couldn't completely relax. The girl carefully opened her eyes, and her cheeks turned slightly red as she immersed herself in her thoughts. The girl was extremely interested to find out what kind of white bird it was. Iris was sure that it would be difficult for her to get away from this monster. It was a bird that constantly appears in front of the girl. First, he helped Iris when there was a drought, and then he helped with the bear. Iris reflected that usually the bird was always watching her from afar. The girl considered her an ill-mannered bird that constantly flies over her and then flies away. Alraune closed her eyes with a smile, thinking how sorry she was that the bear cub did not forgive the bird's bad deeds. She thought that maybe the bird had already been caught. Meanwhile, the white bird flew over the forest while the bear was chasing it. The bird looked at him, holding the pill in its beak. One short glance at the monster was enough to understand everything. At that moment, the bird released the pill from its beak, causing it to quickly fall down. The bear saw this, so he stopped looking for her. The bird continued to watch the bear for a while. After that, the bird flew on. She thought that everything would be fine for a while because she took the bear as far away as possible. After a while, the bird landed near a small old house. Amazingly quickly, the little bird's body began to transform into something else. After a while, she talked about how this life was dangerous and she had to protect the girl. She said that she was very worried about her. Extremely quickly, the little bird took on the form of a girl whose figure was covered in mist. She took a deep breath, thinking that everything was right. The girl carefully adjusted her clothes, after which she lowered her gaze and said that Alraune needed her. The girl blushed slightly after these words. One day, when the girl turned 6, everything changed. She got the opportunity to use black magic, flight, and transformation into various animals. But in exchange for this power, she had to say goodbye to a peaceful life. This caused the girl's hair to change its color. Due to the fact that witches like her were hunted by bad Luli, she and her parents had to run from place to place. The last place they went to was the village that was on the border of the kingdom of Cardania. Although the girl became a witch, she was happy with loving parents. After eating, the girl's mom and dad called Rufus by name with a smile. They told her to come to them. Ruth then ran to her parents with a joyful smile on her face, who treated her warmly and with all their love. The girl was incredibly happy at that time. However, such a calm and pleasant life came to an end one day. The house where the family lived was attacked by someone, and all calm quickly left the walls of this building. After another walk, Ruth returned home, but this time she was not met by her loving parents. She froze with shock on her face and stared in front of her. She was standing on the threshold of the house where there was a pogrom. There was blood all over the walls, floor, and ceiling. It was then that this girl firmly decided that she would never forgive them. She wanted to avenge her parents. Ruth flew through the sky in search of the monster that ruined her happy life. Then the girl noticed a small vine that she saw in the forest. Rufus saw Iris that day, who was ordering a detachment of bees to attack the enemy. At that moment, a bird flew in front of the surprised girl. When she first saw Alraune, Ruth thought that she had met a beautiful man on Earth, incredibly beautiful. However, the girl soon realized that this was not quite a person. The girl who was sitting on the huge flower was only half human. She could fight monsters. Ruth, in the form of a bird, flew nearby and watched Alraune defeat monsters. Then she landed next to me. The girl wanted to try to take revenge by pecking the monster to death, but in the end, he was killed by this girl. Iris looked at the bird in front of her in surprise. Ruth looked at the girl carefully and thought that this flower monster was amazing. At that moment, the two of them looked at each other with extreme fascination. At that moment, the iris vine trembled. The girl tried to catch the bird, so Ruth took off. The girl thought that it was quite dangerous to keep watching the girl. In the past, she had sworn that she would not approach this forest in human form. Then the bird flew away. For this reason, in her free time, Ruth began to fly to the girl in the form of a bird. The girl saw how the girl grew flowers, how she watered them. During the dry season, Ruth caused rain for the girl. Ruth then thought with shock that it looked like Iris had brainwashed the boy. It wasn't surprising, because she was a monster anyway. One day, the girl decided to ask a question to the sage who was staying in the village. Ruth assumed that this monster was called Alraune. Usually, monsters can't speak human language. Ruth decided that the girl was probably an exception. The girl was watching the girl in the form of a bird, sitting on a branch nearby. She looked at her and thought that she was jealous. It was lucky that the girl was able to find Alraune. Iris helped Ruth avenge her parents without realizing it. In addition, it is a rare monster that has the ability to use human language. The girl was sure that if she treated the girl well, then someday they would open their hearts to each other. Ruth was completely convinced that Alraune's girlfriend was special. For this reason, she decided to take care of the talking flower monster, which is unable to move itself because it is a plant. One day, a drop of water fell on the ground, after which it began to rain heavily. Iris was shouting happily at the time. The girl thought that because of this bear, she was already dizzy. She sighed happily because it was raining, which she thought was divine. However, something was bothering her, more specifically, Papa Bear. Despite the fact that Iris was able to buy herself time thanks to the nectar pill, sooner or later the bear will come back. She thought about finding a way to get out of this place as soon as possible. Iris was thinking that she could neither run away nor hide. She didn't know why life was so cruel to her. The girl thought she was very unlucky. When the rain stopped, Iris discovered some rather strange plants. These turned out to be saprophytes, which are rare flowers that grow underground. They live in symbiosis with other plants, acting as a parasite and receive nutrients from them. Because they grow underground, they are very rarely found on the surface. Iris thought about how lucky they were, because they could live underground with plenty of water without fear of unexpected enemies. When the girl was still a high school student, she read about it in a book. This plant looks like a rhizandella flower. Since this plant is a saprophyte, it receives nutrients from fungi. But in fact, it feeds from the roots of nearby trees through a mushroom. Iris thought that she understood something now. Iris thought that this flower was just like a bloodsucker, but only parasitic on its roots. The girl quickly picked up the flower with her vines and sent it into the monster's mouth. Alraune thought with a laugh that now Rhizentella's ability belongs to her. As soon as Papa Bear arrives, the girl will be able to go underground, and then she'll be safe. The bad thing was that with Rhizentella's ability alone, the girl couldn't handle him. However, now the iris will at least be able to survive underground, as it can feed on other plants. While she was digging a hole for herself with a vine, something appeared. Iris looked up at the sky, where a white bird was flying. The girl wondered if it was really her again. The bird was flying nearby, holding a twig in its beak. Iris thought about how it had been several days since Papa Bear's attack. She assumed that the bird had managed to escape from him. Alraune wondered if Papa Bear had eaten her pill. The girl discarded these thoughts, believing that she should not think about it. After all, it is unlikely that the bear will return. She looked at the bird in fascination, and then smiled. Iris grinned, thinking that she had a great idea. By this time, the bird had landed, holding a flower in its beak. The girl thought that it was time to defeat her old enemy. She quickly directed the vines towards the bird. Iris looked at the bird and thought about how she dared to steal its nectar pill. After all, if it weren't for the bird, everything would be different. Alraune couldn't put into words how desperate she was at that moment. After these thoughts, the girl was distracted, thinking that it seemed to her that the bird would be very tasty. She happily wished herself a good appetite. Vines began to rise rapidly from the ground. The vines tried to grab Rufus, so she quickly began to take off, throwing the flower she was holding at the same time. Iris noticed something, so she looked at the bird in surprise. Ruth walked quickly away. A white bird rose into the sky, quickly flying away. Ruth thought that if she hadn't used magic in time, she would have been captured by now. She was shocked to think about how scary it was. Alraune looked at the retreating bird with disappointment. The girl sighed, thinking that she had almost caught her. Iris suddenly noticed a flower that was lying on the ground nearby. She thought about it and remembered that this flower was in the mouth of a bird. The girl picked it up, thinking that it was a retouche flower. It has thorns on the stem, just like ordinary roses. The girl sniffed the flower, thinking that red roses are beautiful. Iris looked at the rose carefully and thought that when birds collect flowers and stems, there can be only one reason for this. Alraune awkwardly closed her eyes, imagining a pair of birds. She thought it was the creation of a nest. Birds create their own home with their partners. Iris thought that she was most likely destined to remain single forever. The girl immediately frowned. She remembered that the younger follower of the saint, that is, the traitor, married the hero. Iris suggested that they probably already have a child, and she was almost impregnated by some unknown flower. It started to rain. Iris reflected that she had no home of her own, no family, and she was standing alone in the rain. The girl sniffed the rose in her hands again. Alraune began to remember how she was attacked by barbaphones, how Papa Bear came. The girl thought that there was nothing funny about it, she just had to do these things. Iris looked up, thinking that at least they could get through all the difficult moments in life together. The girl was thinking that she would like to have a good partner in life. Iris, saying that she was very sorry, threw a flower into the mouth of the lower part of her flower. The girl couldn't taste it. She put those thoughts aside because she just needed to digest him. She suddenly remembered something. Alraune thought that she needed to return the vines that she had sent underground. At that moment, she looked down in surprise, not understanding what had happened. There was a snake on the ground in front of the flower. The girl looked at her in shock and exclaimed that it was not a vine, but a snake. At that moment, the huge snake opened its mouth and headed towards the frightened girl. Alraune tearfully asked the snake to stop. She screamed in her mind that she had experienced it once before. Iris didn't want to be eaten again. A large snake approached directly to the stem of a large flower, intending to bite it off, which would certainly bring Iris a lot of problems. The girl managed to react quickly and used her flower magic, directing her prickly vines at the reptile. They quickly clung to the snake's body, leaving it unable to move. At that very moment, the snake's head rose a little higher, and a white liquid flowed from its mouth. Immediately after that, the animal fell to the ground dead. Iris only watched for a while as white liquid flowed out of the snake's mouth, and the monster itself slowly died. Seeing that it was over, Iris took a deep breath, thinking that this snake had incredibly slippery skin, and because of this she could not grab the monster, and in this regard her thorns helped her a lot. She sighed, thinking that it was very good that she had previously managed to absorb that rose, thanks to which Iris managed to create a new weapon from her vines and thorns. Now, her vines looked like sharp blackberry bushes, and so Iris was successfully able to survive another attack. However, soon after she defeated that snake, she faced another nuisance in the form of another attack. A large number of wild boars wanting to eat were rushing in one large herd to the forest, heading straight for Iris. The girl, seeing such an open attack, quickly prepared herself and used her long vines. She brandished them, defeating the boars one by one until there was not a single living enemy left next to her. Iris caught her breath heavily, after which she looked at it in disbelief and wondered what was going on in this forest at all, and why there were so many enemies there. She looked at the bodies of the already dead boars, after which she thought that she had already killed a whole bunch of monsters, but there were no fewer of them. There were so many of them that the girl was not even sure that she would be able to eat them all at all. Her flour was full of food and didn't need it anymore for a while. The girl decided not to worry about this and smiled broadly, thinking that now she can calmly deal with anyone who decides to attack her, because she has really become much stronger lately. She suggested that maybe there aren't many enemies there, due to the fact that one of the monsters of the apocalypse is no more. As soon as a strong monster disappears, the weaker ones try to take its place. Considering that Iris is a mysterious plant that defeated a large snake, many people paid attention to it. She also remembered that the 4 monsters of the apocalypse are Heelanwolf, the Hound of Hell, Vanchlin, a huge snake, Lobar, Papa Bear, the Lord of the Forest. There was also a 4th person there, but Iris couldn't remember the last monster. Suddenly, the girl thought about what could happen if all these monsters attacked her at the same time. She was fully aware of the fact that she had certainly become stronger lately, but that would be too much even for her. Papa Bear, Laubar, was a particular danger to her. He was too strong, and she didn't know if she could beat him. The girl tightly clenched her hands into fists, after which she firmly decided that she just needed to become even stronger, so that at the moment when this monster comes, she could do something. Iris raised her hands high and exclaimed that she simply had to cope with this monster, and then live the most peaceful life. She took a deep breath, then screamed loudly, creating motivation for herself. A whole month after her very first meeting with Papa Bear Laubar, something happened that Iris could not have expected at all. A huge bear appeared in front of the girl. His whole face was dripping with his own saliva as he looked at Iris, who was trying to figure out if this was serious at the moment. After that, she turned her gaze to the other side, where she saw another huge bear that looked no less hungry than the first one. This bear had 2 horns on its head, while the last one had 1. Iris got angry and thought about the fact that she doesn't serve couples in this place. The girl smiled tensely, thinking that her body would simply not stand if they licked her at the same time. The girl looked at what was happening in the square, simultaneously trying to analyze the whole situation. She thought that if they attacked her at the same time, then she would simply run out of nectar, and she would tighten up extremely quickly. The girl was looking at the 2 bears that were slowly approaching her. Iris wondered what she could do in such a situation. Sweat trickled down her face, and suddenly an idea came to her of exactly where she could start the battle. The girl looked at this small but extremely agile wife bear, who had been watching Iris all this time. The girl grinned and licked one of her vines, after which a fairly large amount of nectar appeared on it. She wished that this bear would come closer to her so that they could have fun. For her, it was like a bachelorette party, inhaling on which was strictly forbidden to any men. The girl raised her hand high, pointing the vine at the bear. She thought that 1 sip of nectar would be at the expense of Iris herself. At the very moment when Iris waved the vine, an appetizing and fragrant nectar sparkled in the air, attracting all the attention of the monsters. Without thinking twice, the bear immediately rushed for a sweet drink, making loud screams. The monster did not move so fast, which gave Iris more time to think about everything and come up with the next moves and attacks. The girl's expression was extremely focused and attentive. Iris watched the bear approaching her quickly. She was waiting for the most appropriate moment and distance so that the monster would be close enough to her. She was going to attack and use her original idea. At that very moment, when Iris was extremely attentive, the bear's paw touched the ground, under which all the necessary vines covered with thorns had already been passed. In the blink of an eye, the entire vine burst out of the ground, which was why the bear was in an extremely bad position. The vines began to rise higher and higher while the monster was in turmoil. Taking advantage of this moment, the iris vines completely twisted the bear from all sides so that it remained completely motionless. Because of such a helpless condition, the bear began to scream, putting her paws on the vines above. Iris smiled with a smile, asking if the bear was really trying the girl's branded toxins for the first time. These were natural, homemade poisonous thorns. The girl also added that they are popular in this forest. Earlier, the girl soaked all her thorns with poisonous pollen so that the attacks would be more effective. Not everyone can withstand such a strong poison that it can penetrate the body in a variety of places. The bear began to exert all her strength in order to escape from the grip of the vines. She was growling loudly, squirming and trying to do her best. Iris, on the other hand, thought that everything was wrong, and the fun was not over. The girl smiled sweetly, looking at the bear. She noted that it was time for the ball, and she was wondering if this bear, by any chance, would like to invite this lady to one dance. A huge monster, with an open mouth, from which sharp fangs protruded, rushed forward. The twigs of a plant with thorns rushed towards him. The monster swung its clawed paw and tore one of the rods, but the others gradually began to wrap around it from all sides. One of the monster's paws turned up, and he fell to the ground last time. His mouth was open, sharp fangs and tongue sticking out of it. The monster had something like a horn on its head. The monster was lying on the ground and leaning on one of its clawed paws. The rods with spikes were behind the monster's back. Rods with spikes emerged from the ground and gradually began to envelop the monster, with a horn on its head from all sides. The monster's mouth was open, sharp teeth were sticking out of it, and a tongue was sticking out of it. As soon as the spiked bars enveloped the monster, it began to growl loudly. Arlaune stood motionless and watched the monster's further actions. She was all tense, and sweat was running down her face. In the next instant, the monster spreads its clawed paws to the sides and thereby frees itself from the spikes that enveloped it. Arlaune put one hand forward. In her other hand, there were several fruits similar to apples. She began to throw them into the air. Arlaune was wearing a belt with many shimmering flowers. Arlaune held fruits in her hands and smiled. Then she started throwing fruits, and thinking that this papa bear was hungry, he probably hadn't eaten anything since he tasted her nectar. 2 apples shimmering in the light appeared in the air. Arlaune thought that everything was not so simple. These apples also contained her pollen. One of the apples turned out to be above the bear monster. He lifted his paws up and began to reach for the apple that contained Arlaune pollen. The monster raised 3 paws up. It opened its mouth. 2 apples flew to meet it. Arlaune held the apples in her hands. She smiled and thought that the monster could take more apples, since she had a lot of them, namely 20 pieces. The apples ended up in the monster's mouth. He began to eat them greedily. Drool dripped from his mouth and the remains of apples fell. The monster kept its paws close to the muzzle. After a while, the monster opened its mouth wide and began to scream. Tears and drool poured from its mouth and eyes. Arlaune was holding apples in her hands, and when she heard the roar of the monster, she got scared and backed away. Arlaune wondered if her plan had already worked or not yet. There were spikes around Arlaune. She was not far from the monster, and thought that the monster impressed her, since only 1 apple works on other monsters, and Arlaune does not take it. After a lot of water, the monster opened its toothy mouth, from which the tongue fell out, and began to growl loudly. Without thinking for a long time, the monster began to rush towards Arlaune with its mouth open. She was standing in place. There were spikes around her. Arlaune began to act. She released the spikes towards the monster, which was running at her with great speed. Drooling from the monster's open mouth, it was rushing towards Arlaune, and several rods with spikes were moving to meet it. There were only a few meters between Arlaune and the monster. Arlaune looked in front of her and thought that she had been preparing for a similar battle with a monster all this month. The next moment, Arlaune puts her hand to her mouth, from which she pulls out something round. Then, Arlaune puts this object in one of the bars, which rushed towards the monster. The monster was watching the rod with its mouth open. There was a round object in the rod. Arlaune thought that this was the pill that the bear monster wanted so much. The round object shimmered in the light. Arlaune thought that there was a deadly poison in this pill. For more than a month, she pumped it with her toxin. Arlaune held her hand out in front of her. Then she imagined the pill that was in the glass. Arlaune thought that this pill would be the monster's last supper. It was the least she could repay him for dancing. There was a pill in front of the monster in the rod. The monster was staring at her hungrily, its tongue sticking out of its open mouth, drooling down it. The monster completely swallowed the pill with the tip of the rod. When the monster's mouth slammed shut, its drool appeared in the air. As soon as the monster swallowed the pill, Arlaune started up and squeezed her eyes shut. The monster was standing not far from Arlaune and eating a pill. The monster began to lick his lips. Everything was covered in his saliva. Arlaune opened her eyes and looked anxiously at the monster. The monster loomed over Arlaune, and thorned rods spread around them on the ground. The next moment, the poison pill was on the ground. The poison pill was covered in saliva. It rolled away not far from the guys. Arlaune anxiously wondered if the monster had felt the poison. Out of fear, Arlaune held out her hand in front of her, and thought that Arlaune did not want the monster to start licking her again. The monster opened its mouth, drooling from it. The monster stood motionless. After a while, it began to fall on its side. Arlaune continued to hold her hands to her face. With a crash, the monster collapsed to the ground. Its mouth was open. The pill was poured not far from the guys. Arlaune looked at the immobilized body of the monster. Leaves were spread around her, and rods with thorns were spreading on the ground. The flower belt on Arlaune's body shimmered. She looked down in surprise at the monster, from whose mouth something was leaking. Drops of sweat were running down Arlaune's face. She couldn't take her eyes off the monster. After a while, she opened her mouth and looked up. Arlaune put her hands down on the petals and thought that she was a completely ordinary flower called Alraune. A monster lay motionless in front of Arlaune, and she held the second monster with spikes. Arlaune began to think that even though she was just a plant, she would become the mistress of this forest. Arlaune spread her arms to the side and began to smile. She looked at the bees and wondered if Arlaune had woken up. Arlaune thought she would feed the awakened bees with nectar. The bees began to drink Arlaune's nectar. She was sitting astride a flower with a toothy mouth. Arlaune put down several of herself and thought that she needed to upgrade their rank and make sure that Arlaune would continue to guard her. Arlaune covered her mouth with her hand and laughed. Behind her were the lush crowns of trees, over which something began to fly. There was a large white bird in the air, holding a small flower in its beak. Next to the bird was a translucent girl, Ruth. The bird was hovering in circles around Arlaune. She was carefully watching the soaring bird. The bird was holding a flower in its beak. Arlaune put her hands down and looked at the bird. She thought she was wondering why this white bird was here. The bird opens its beak slightly and a flower falls out of it. The flower falls right into Arlaune's hands. She raises her head and looks at the white bird. The bird flies up to the tree and plucks another flower from there, which it throws to Arlaune. There were several flowers on Arlaune, which the bird brought to her. Arlaune put her hand to her face and thought that the bird was really teasing her. Arlaune held a twig of flowers in her hands and thought that perhaps with this gesture the bird wanted to say that she would pick Arlaune like other flowers. The bird was soaring in the sky. Arlaune thought that this white bird was really very strange. After a while, the wind began to rise. The foxes that were lying on the ground began to rise in the air around Arlaune. Arlaune wrapped herself in vines. She looked up and thought that winter had come. She had not received enough light, and the animals began to hibernate because of this. She had less food. Arlaune introduced several bees and thought that she had been bored lately. She had not seen her bees for a long time. Arlaune began to prepare for the winter. The white bird began to make noise. Then the bird landed on the bald branches of a tree that was not far from Arlaune. Arlaune began to look at the bird carefully and think that only this bird continues to visit her. Several birds began to take off from the crown of the tree, not far from Arlaune. Arlaune were very noisy. Arlaune was watching them closely. A white bird was sitting on a branch. Arlaune put her hand to her face and thought that Arlaune had not heard the white bird singing, and Arlaune herself had not spoken to anyone for a long time. Arlaune looked at the bird and said that she was greeting the bird and she was wondering if the bird could sing. The white bird made a surprised look. Arlaune did not take her eyes off the white bird and waited for her answer. The bird and Arlaune looked at each other in silence. Then Arlaune lifted her hand and turned away. Arlaune thought that she was very, very bored, so she was trying to talk to the bird. At this time, the bird opened its beak slightly. The bird nervously opened its beak and began to chirp. Arlaune thought that the bird had finally started talking, but it sounded too terrible. Arlaune put her hand to her chin and thought that at least the bird sings naturally, but she probably skipped singing lessons. The bird was sitting on a branch and was gloomy. Arlaune looked at the bird and thought that she understood this bird. Arlaune began to say whether the bird could sing louder. The bird made a satisfied face and began to chirp again. The bird started walking on a branch and suddenly took off. Arlaune thought that she really wasn't such a bad teacher, but she wondered what the bird was really telling her. Arlaune reached up for the flying bird. Arlaune leaned forward a little and thought that the bird should not fly away, since Arlaune would be lonely. Apparently she was already used to the visits of this bird. The leaves of the plants swayed in the gusty wind. The next day, Arlaune had another white visitor. It was snow. The leaves were covered in frost. Arlaune's leaves were covered with frost. She did not know what to do next, because she could not lose her leaves. Arlaune looked up nervously and thought that she was not an eternally green plant, and, in general, it was hard for her to think about such a thing. She was an angiosperm, and she had buds. Arlaune covered the mouth of the flower. Arlaune put her hand to her face and thought that she needed to find a way to save her leaves in winter. Then an idea struck Arlaune and she looked up. Arlaune imagined a sleeping bear and put her hand to her lips. Then she began to think that she needed to get the ability to resist the cold. Arlaune looked away. Arlaune lowered her arms to the bottom and lifted her head up. A white bird sat on the branches of a tree and looked attentively at Arlaune. Arlaune looked at the bird and began to say that she wanted the bird to bring her a flower. Arlaune started waving her arms and thinking that if the bird found flowers, then these flowers were resistant to frost, but Arlaune had not seen such flowers in the vicinity. Arlaune joined her hands together and began to beg the bird. Arlaune thought the bird should help her. A bird flew up from a tree branch. The white bird flew into the sky. Arlaune put her hands on the petals of her flower and looked at the flying bird. The next day, the bird brought Arlaune a Christmas flower. Arlaune was still cold, and this flower is able to withstand temperatures up to -15 degrees. Arlaune looked gratefully at the bird. A lot of snow fell the next day. The branches of the trees bent down from the weight of the snowdrifts. The mountains were also covered with snow. The branches bent down from the weight of the snow. Snowdrifts formed around Arlaune. She reflected that snow is good when it melts and turns into water, but with so much snow she doesn't know what to do. Snow began to fall from the branches of the trees. Arlaune hid in the petals of her own flower. She looked up and thought that if she was covered with snow, she would not be able to survive. Arlaune looked at the mouth of her flower and thought it was too late to try to dig herself out. There was snow on Arlaune's head. Everything began to get dark around Arlaune. She wrapped herself in her petals and thought that why she became a plant, she was very tired of everything and she wanted to sleep. Darkness fell before Arlaune's eyes. After a while, Ruth turns out to be near Arlaune. She raised her hand up, and in her other hand she had a shovel. Ruth began to conjure, and a snowdrift rose up, which covered Arlaune. Ruth was wearing a hood, and a scarf covered half of her face. She put her hand in front of her and thought that Arlaune was lucky. She needed an eye and an eye. Ruth continued to conjure and stir the snowdrifts aside. After a while, there were no snowdrifts around Arlaune. Ruth thought it would be hard for her to come here often. Ruth remembered that she had once seen a plant that had sprouted from under the snow. Ruth stood in front of Arlaune and thought that if she fed that plant to Arlaune, then maybe she could also sprout from under the snow. Arlaune was wrapped in her flower. She was not visible, and her tentacles wrapped around the entire plant completely. Snow continued to fall on Arlaune. Ruth stared in front of her, then her cheeks turned red and her mouth tightened. Ruth thought that she would definitely protect Arlaune, so she had nothing to worry about. Ruth imagined herself in the form of a bird and the form of Arlaune. Ruth thought that she and Arlaune were in the same position. They were both afraid of people, so they had to live in isolation. Ruth imagined Arlaune's smiling face and thought that Arlaune was the most important thing in Ruth's life right now. She was worried only about her parents, but her parents had died a long time ago. Ruth blushed and smiled. Then she thought that she had spent too much effort on Arlaune, so it could be considered that she was her personal plant. Ruth began to think that one day she would definitely come and water Arlaune again. Arlaune's eyes began to open gradually. Arlaune started to step out of her flower and look around. Then she thought she didn't understand what was going on and where the snow had gone around her. Arlaune had her hands on her petals. Then something fell on top of her. Arlaune looked up and saw a white bird. Arlaune took the object that the white bird had brought her. Arlaune started looking at it and thinking that it looked like a skunk cabbage. Arlaune imagined this plant and thought that this plant could emit up to 20 degrees of heat. If Arlaune ate it, he would be able to survive the winter. Arlaune lay down on her petals and began to smile. Then she began to think that the water from the melted snow would begin to flow directly to her roots. There was no snow around Arlaune. She was lying on her petals, looking at a bird flying in the air and thinking how to thank her. Arlaune studied the bird carefully. The bird was flying in the air, and Arlaune's tentacles were enveloping her plant. Arlaune thought that maybe this bird had dug her out of the snow, although birds are incapable of such a thing. Arlaune looked in front of her and thought that she was safe now. She was very grateful to this mysterious creature who cleaned the snow around her. Arlaune imagined Santa Claus, but then she drooped. Arlaune thought that Santa had dug her up, but most likely, there is no Santa in this world, and in general, he is not real. Arlaune studied the white bird flying in the sky. The bird was floating in the air, and Arlaune thought that she was grateful to the bird. The bird had already helped Arlaune out so many times, she no longer intended to try to eat the bird. Large snowdrifts formed on the roof of the wooden house. Ruth turned out to be at the wooden year. She was reincarnated from a bird into a man. Ruth was wearing gloves on her hands. She was adjusting her hood, and with a smile on her face, she thought that Arlaune should already understand that Ruth did not mean her harm. Ruth was standing around the corner of a wooden house. Not far from her stood a man in high boots and with a shovel in his hands. After a while, the shovel falls into the snow. Ruth pulled away. She looked fearfully in the direction from where they began to shout that the season would soon change and spring would come. Bright rays of sunlight filtered through the branches of the trees. Flower buds began to bloom from under the tree. The snow on the branches of the trees began to melt under the warm sunlight. It was a paradise for all plants. Arlaune raised her hand above her head. Her flower petals were open. A blush appeared on Arlaune's face, and she began to look up at the bright sun. There were almost no clouds in the sky, and bright and warm sunlight shone on the ground. The snow that lay on the trees began to gradually melt. There was a loud crunching sound in the complete darkness. The crowns of the lush trees swayed in the wind. Loud noises could be heard all over the area. An incomprehensible creature with a bull's head was walking through the forest. His mouth was slightly open, and his teeth were sticking out of it. The creature had a helmet on its head. Arlaune and Fury were sitting at the table. Arlaune had a crown on her head. She was smiling and holding a cup in her hands. Fury was sitting next to me. She was smiling too and leaning her hands on the table. Flowers bloomed and butterflies flew around the girls. Arlaune was sitting on her flower. She raised her arms up. Bees were flying around her and tentacles were developing in different directions. Arlaune was sitting at the table. She was holding a piece of paper in her hands and sniffing it. Behind her stood a replica of her, who was dressed in a military costume with a spear and a hat on her head. Arlaune was sitting on her flower. She had her hands up and was smiling broadly. Flowers bloomed around Arlaune, and nectar flowed from her tentacles, which were raised up, and butterflies and bees drank it. Arlaune looked at the butterflies and thought that she had new guests today. Butterflies, which are a real treasure of nature. The butterflies had large wings, a proboscis, and antennae that protruded from their heads. The butterfly was flying in the air. A plume was developing behind it. Arlaune thought that one of the butterflies was flying ahead of everyone, and it was distinguished by its unusual beauty and grace. The butterfly was flying to meet Arlaune. Arlaune looked at her and thought that the butterfly should not fly close to her, since there is pollen on her wings, and she can pollinate Arlaune. The butterfly was flying over Arlaune. Arlaune stared at the butterfly in surprise. Arlaune thought that the butterfly should listen to her advice, as it might end up being eaten. After a moment, the butterfly is enveloped by tentacles from the Arlaune flower. The tentacles with the butterfly began to approach the open mouth of the Arlaune flower. The petals of Arlaune's flower were unfurled, and her flower belt shimmered brightly. Arlaune raised her hands up again and rejoiced in the sun. The tentacles of her flower were raised up, and nectar flowed from them, which butterflies and bees drank. A noise was heard in the depths of the dense forest. Soon, Arlaune's fun was interrupted by a very loud and incomprehensible sound. There was a noise in the forest, among the thick tree trunks, and the next moment a large tree cracked and fell to the ground. The noise was not far from Arlaune. She lowered her hands to the bottom and began to stare in the direction from which the noise was coming. Butterflies and bees continued to drink nectar. A Minotaur began to approach Arlaune through the thicket of the forest. A large monster with a bull's head, on which was a helmet with horns, and in the hands of the monster was a weapon. Arlaune looked at the approaching monster and thought that the Minotaur is not as big as Papa Bear, but they are also called demons. Arlaune have high intelligence. Some of them can wield magic. There was a drawing on the monster's helmet. Arlaune removed the tentacles of the flower and became alert. She began to think that the pattern on the helmet said that the monster belongs to the army of demons. She must protect this forest by any means. The monster came out of the forest and gradually moved towards Arlaune. There were no bees and butterflies left around Arlaune. Arlaune had flown away. Arlaune was wary. She remembered that she had fought demons 4 years ago, and then she was a saint. She wondered what this monster had forgotten in the forest. Arlaune was serious. She looked at the monster and thought that she would have to defeat this monster in order to continue living in peace. Arlaune directed the thorny vines towards the armed monster. As the vines raced towards the monster, he raised his weapon up and began to swing it. A smile could be seen on his face. The monster struck the thorn vines with all its might. Arlaune looked at the monster in surprise and thought that he was really strong. He should not be allowed close. Vines with thorns were moving underground towards the monster. Vines burst out of the ground and began to envelop the monster from all sides and strike at it. The monster stood silently in place. The monster stood still and did not move. Arlaune clenched her hands into a fist and began to think that because of the monster's armor, her vines could not strike. She would have to come up with another way to attack. Acrid smoke began to rise from the mouth of the Arlaune flower. The monster put its paws and its weapon in front of it. The monster viciously began to look in the direction of Arlaune through his weapon. The smoke from the Arlaune flower was developing around the area. The monster lowered his arms and weapons to the bottom and began to walk towards Arlaune. She thought that the monster was using an axe to defend itself from the poisonous cloud. Arlaune stared at the monster, which began to swing its axe to attack. Arlaune thought that was exactly what she had foreseen. The monster held its arms above itself and swung at Arlaune with all its might. She, in turn, began to emit an unusual light around her. The monster stopped abruptly. Liquid came out of his mouth and eyes, and he began to cough. The monster backed away. Arlaune looked down at the monster. Arlaune raised her hands in the air and began to rejoice at her victory. But the monster began to rummage in the pocket that was on his belt. Arlaune was wary when I was surprised that the monster started taking something out of his pocket. The monster took out a small container with liquid inside from his pocket. The monster started drinking this liquid. Seeing this, Arlaune was very surprised. The empty container fell to the ground. Arlaune looked at the monster and thought that this was really an antidote. This move was not honest on the part of the monster. The monster picked up a weapon and began waving it in front of him. Vines with thorns began to reflect the monster's blows. One vine came out of the ground and grabbed the monster by the paw. He was startled and started to fall. The monster was sitting on the ground and trying to free its paw. A bright flower with sharp teeth began to rush out of the ground at the monster. A flower with sharp teeth hovered over the monster. Arlaune began to think that her ogre flower should have hit the monster point blank. Liquid was flowing from the monster's mouth and nose. He was lying on the ground without moving. Arlaune stared intently at the monster's immobilized body. Arlaune put her hand to her mouth. Then she began to search the defeated monster with the help of her vines. Arlaune thought that the monster was really very strong. She had spent too much energy on it. From the monster's bag, Arlaune pulled out several vials of antidote, a potion of sleep, paralysis, and a small piece of paper with a picture of a man. Arlaune thought that why would a monster carry a human image with him? Arlaune studied the image of the man carefully. She thought that maybe the monster was looking for this man. He needed potions to capture this man. Arlaune imagined a flickering line in the pitch darkness and thought she had too many questions. But after a while, other demons came to Arlaune, namely a whole bunch of Minotaurs. The Arlaune were armed and vicious. Arlaune smiled and thought that the second round was waiting for her. The monsters were walking towards Arlaune. The monsters looked at their defeated kinsmen and then looked at Arlaune. The monsters began to look at each other and growl incomprehensibly. One of the monsters with an eye patch was staring intently at Arlaune. She also did not look away. Then Arlaune heard the monster's voice that she looked delicious. The monster with the eye patch began to smile maliciously, and the weapon in his hands began to burn brightly. Arlaune was very scared. She looked at the weapon and thought that the monster could really possess fire magic. Arlaune imagined herself and her flower on fire. She began to think that she would not be able to defeat them, because she is a plant that cannot resist fire. The monsters surrounded their defeated kinsmen. Arlaune looked at Arlaune and began to say that she had dealt with their kinsmen. Arlaune was scared by these words. The monster with the eye patch opened its mouth and started saying that Arlaune had to serve them or Arlaune would burn her. Arlaune looked at the monsters with fear. Arlaune began to look at the monsters in fright and think that if the monsters really wanted her to serve them, Arlaune probably knew about her nectar. Arlaune looked ahead and nervously reflected that if she was going to serve them, what would happen to her next? What about her dignity? Arlaune needed to immediately decide what to do next. Her flower opened its mouth, and the vines began to fall to the ground. Arlaune squeezed her eyes shut. But I opened them abruptly, because I heard some noise next to me. Out of nowhere, butterflies and wasps appeared in the air. Arlaune began to look around in surprise. Her petals and belt shimmered brightly. The butterfly, which stood out from the environment of other butterflies, accompanied all the insects. Arlaune stared in front of her in surprise. The space began to flicker brightly, and Arlaune began to reflect that the bees and Her Highness, the majestic butterfly, had come to save her, but it was very dangerous, since one fiery attack could destroy them. Arlaune stared in front of her with her mouth open. Then tears poured out of her eyes, and she thought that the insects had really come to save her. One of the Arlaune vines got up and started hitting the monster with the eye patch. His weapon continued to burn. The monster with the bandaged eye looked at Arlaune and admired her strength. Arlaune wiped her tears with her hands and wondered if everyone was ready to make an attack. Arlaune began to smile with tears in her eyes. She raised her hands and began to think that now was the time to make an attack on the monsters. Behind Arlaune, the butterflies and bees were ready for battle. Several petals began to float in the shimmering air. Arlaune thought that the rules were simple. You can only survive in the forest if you outplay your enemy. Arlaune stood still, her hands on the petals of her flower. There were butterflies and bees around Arlaune. She began to say that why the monsters had come to her forest. Armed monsters in armor looked at Arlaune. The monster with an eye patch began to say that they had no business in the forest. Their business was before that. There were flames around the monsters. The monster with the bandage continued to say that Arlaune is an amazing plant. She defeated their kinsman, so they will take her away. Arlaune wondered why the minions of the demon army were in such a wilderness. Arlaune was surrounded by insects. She looked at the monsters and thought that in the vicinity of the forest there was only a village of a boy who loved her nectar. Did the monsters intend to visit this village? The next moment, Arlaune puts his hands in front of him and begins to secrete poisonous pollen. A cloud of poisonous pollen was approaching the monsters. They began to cover themselves with their weapons. Immediately after the cloud of poisonous pollen, bees rushed into battle. The bees quickly overtook the monsters and surrounded them. The bees started attacking the monsters. Arlaune thought that the bees could overwhelm these monsters. The bees had dispersed their forces very well. The main squirrel hovered in the air. An unusual light emanated from it, which gradually began to flicker. The butterfly had antennae and a proboscis, and a train developed behind it. The main butterfly began to attack the monsters. It hovered over one of them. Arlaune looked at what was happening and thought that Bolarister was already convulsing, but the Minotaurs were hiding from the bees with their weapons. She remembered the faces of her battle spears and thought that they would be able to deal with the Minotaurs in no time. The next moment, the monster with the eye patch lights up a weapon, and he starts waving it in different directions, scaring away bees. The eyes of the monster with the eye patch and Arlaune met. Arlaune was afraid for the safety of the main butterfly and released vines with thorns from the ground. The swarm of butterflies and bees retreated a little, and Arlaune and the monster with the eye patch were separated by vines with thorns. The monster's weapon continued to burn. Arlaune looked at the monster with a serious expression and waited for its attack. The monster stood still and looked at Arlaune, his weapon burning. The monster held a burning weapon in his hands. Then he got into a fighting pose. Arlaune decided to attack first and send her vines into battle. The monster easily waved his fire weapon, and the vines that were rushing at him became chopped up. Several thorned vines lay on the ground, and their tips, which came into contact with the monster's weapon, began to burn. Fire was coming from the monster's weapon, and the monster began to gradually approach from Arlaune. Arlaune nervously looked at the monster and wondered if Liana had really caught fire. Arlaune lowered her hands to the bottom. Something caught her attention. A monster with an eye patch was walking towards Arlaune and cutting through thorned vines with his fire weapon. Arlaune stood still each time she directed her vines with thorns towards the monster with the eye patch, which was coming at her. After the monster's attack, the vines lay on the ground and burned. Arlaune thought she needed to come up with a new plan of attack. The monster with the eye patch started shouting that Arlaune should surrender. They would not do anything to her, she would just serve them. The monster was standing a few meters away from Arlaune. Beads of sweat were running down Arlaune's face. Arlaune looked ahead and saw her bees continuing to attack the remaining monsters. Arlaune looked ahead warily and thought that the monster should stop talking nonsense. She did not intend to give up so easily. The main butterfly and the others also attacked the remaining monsters, around which there was a lot of poisonous pollen. Arlaune watched the process and thought that until she burned down, she would take with her everyone she could reach. A monster with an eye patch stood in front of Arlaune. Bees and butterflies continued to attack the remaining monsters. Suddenly, vines with thorns appeared from the ground. Vines with tongs appeared from the ground and began to wrap around the remaining monsters. The monsters did not expect this and were scared. The main butterfly hovered over the monster, which was immobilized by vines with thorns, and it began to release poisonous pollen. Liquids began to flow out of the monster's nose and mouth. The main butterfly hovered over the monster and exuded poisonous pollen. The monster was immobilized by vines with thorns. After a while, he fell to his knees. Bees hovered over the monster and began to attack it. The Minotaur with the eye patch was distracted. He turned back. At that moment, Arlaune focused and began to emit a flickering light. The cloud of poison that Arlaune released headed towards the Minotaur with one eye. The monster's weapon caught fire again, and he raised it above him, thereby creating a circle of fire around him. A monster with a blindfold over one eye stood in front of Arlaune. Flames were around him. Arlaune wondered if the monster was fireproof. Arlaune put her hands on her belt and looked at the monster with a serious expression on her face. Then she thought that in that case, her pollen was useless too. She was already getting scared. Arlaune looked down. Her vines with thorns were lying on the ground, and they were burning. The fire came close to the Arlaune flower. She thought that the fire was running through her vines, as if through a wick. Arlaune looked in front of her. A monster with an eye patch stood next to her. The ground around him was burning. Bees were flying in the air nearby. Arlaune nervously looked at the Minotaur she had defeated first. He lay motionless, his weapon lying on the ground. Arlaune had an idea. Arlaune, with a serious expression on her face, directed her vines towards the previously defeated Minotaur. There were beads of sweat on Arlaune's face. Arlaune used her vines to grab the weapon of the defeated Minotaur and cut through the vines with thorns, along which the fire was approaching her. Arlaune sat on her toothy flower. She held the Minotaur's weapon with vines and began to smile. Then she thought that being a plant, she had forgotten that she could use weapons in battle. Arlaune held the weapon of the defeated Minotaur with her vines. The ground next to the monster was burning, and he was fighting off the weaves with his weapon. Arlaune thought that she had never seen a flower with a weapon. She urgently needed to act. Arlaune looked at the monsters lying on the ground. They were motionless, and an idea struck her. Arlaune, using her vines, began to dig into the pocket on the belt of one of the monsters. Arlaune's eyes widened as she found something worthwhile in the monster's pocket. The monster with the eye patch opened its toothy mouth and began to growl loudly. The monster with the eye patch began to wave its fire weapon in all directions, thereby driving away the bees. As soon as the monster, with an eye patch, completed its attack, the defeated insects fell to the ground. Arlaune looked at the insects and thought that she regretted what had happened. The smoke began to disperse in the air, and Arlaune thought that she had only one opponent left. She would protect the inhabitants of the forest at any cost. She would not forgive herself if someone else got hurt. One of the containers broke on the helmet of the monster with an eye patch. He did not expect this. The monster glared at Arlaune, liquid dripping down his helmet. A fire was burning around the monster with one eye. Its body began to shake. The monster was very surprised by this. Arlaune imagined the flasks of liquid and thought it was good that she had managed to take the potions from the defeated monsters. Arlaune stared at the one-eyed monster, which was enveloped in flames. Arlaune's vines began to reach for the weapons of other defeated monsters. Arlaune imagined the vials of liquid and thought that she might have an antidote. Suddenly, sharp sounds began to be heard. Lena Arlaune held several monsters. Then they began to stick weapons into the bags of these monsters. Arlaune thought she would destroy all the antidotes the monsters had. Arlaune remembered that she had started in the bag of monsters, not how many types of herbs, trauma, and fayol they are needed to make a potion of paralysis and sleeping pills. Arlaune began to emit a thick fog that began to spread throughout the area. Arlaune thought that if she ate these herbs, she would be able to use their ability. The monster with the eye patch began to wave its fire weapon, and thus the thick fog that Arlaune was emitting began to dissipate. Arlaune looked at the monster with a serious expression on her face. She frowned and thought that maybe the monster had scattered her thick fog again. Arlaune tensed. She took the weapon of the defeated monster with her vines and threw it at the Minotaur with one eye. The Minotaur was still armed and flames were burning around him. The monster with one eye deflected Arlaune's blow. The weapon that Arlaune launched at the Minotaur plunged into the burning ground. Behind the Minotaur, a weapon was sticking out of the ground, surrounded by fire. A vine with thorns appeared behind the Minotaur and grabbed for a weapon. Beads of sweat were running down the Minotaur's face. His legs were shaking. He couldn't move. Flames flickered in the wind. Arlaune wondered if the monster couldn't see her vines because of the bandage, or if it was the flames that prevented him from seeing. Arlaune took the weapon, which was sticking out of the ground, with the help of her vine with thorns. Arlaune thought she had filled her thorns with poison and wrapped a vine around the handle of the axe. The monster's body was shaking and sweating. Arlaune looked at the monster with a smile on her face and thought that most likely one of the thorns of the vine, which was soaked in poison, pierced the monster's arm and now he cannot move it. Arlaune grabbed the one-eyed monster with the help of her vines. She was looking at him. Two axes were sticking out of the ground next to the monster. In an instant, everything went dark. Only sparks from the dying fire were visible. The Minotaur with one eye said that he apologized to Mr. Grushwand. The next moment, the monster opens its toothy mouth and begins to growl loudly. Hearing this, Arlaune was scared. Arlaune looked at the monster in surprise, which began to burn. She thought that the monster had really set itself on fire. The monster with one eye was enveloped in fire. Arlaune looked at him anxiously and thought that she could not believe that the monster could not use a weapon, and because of this, he decided to set fire to his hand. The monster with one eye was all black. Smoke and flames emanated from it. As a result, the Minotaur collapsed to the ground. The Arlaune vines released the monster. The flames began to move into the trees, which scared Arlaune very much. The roots of the tree and the grass began to burn. Arlaune looked at the fire with horror and thought that the monster wanted to take her with him. The flames had already begun to move to the nearest trees. The flames began to move from tree to tree. Arlaune thought in horror that she needed to figure out what to do next. At this rate, the whole forest could burn down and she along with it. The wooden house had a window through which a bright glow could be seen in the roughness of the densely planted forest. In the house itself, not far from the window, there was a girl with a bandage on her lair. Ruth was sitting in the house. Her hands and feet were tied, and her body was tied to a large wooden box. She remembered that she was caught by a man who told the others that she was a witch. He saw Ruth using magic. People grabbed Ruth and decided to lock her in the barn. She begged people not to do it. Ruth opened her eyes a little, then she hugged her bound legs to her. Arlaune was on her flower. The crown of a lush tree was burning in front of her, and the wind was blowing Arlaune's hair. Nearby trees and shrubs were also on fire. Several trees around Arlaune began to burn, thick and dark smoke rising into the air. Arlaune looked around and thought that things were really bad. Almost the whole forest was already on fire. Several butterflies and bees began to fly away from the flames. Arlaune anxiously looked around and thought that if she could persuade everyone to escape from the forest, then she herself would not be able to escape, since she was a plant. The crowns of the tall trees were engulfed in flames. Arlaune pointed several of her vines in their direction and thought she had to do something before the fire spread even further. Several of the vines that Arlaune had released grabbed onto the wide trunks of the burning trees. Arlaune's brows were furrowed. She was determined. Arlaune used her vines to uproot several trees, as she did with every burning tree. Arlaune thought she should remove the burning trees to stop the spread of the fire. One of Arlaune's vines began to burn. Without hesitation, Arlaune took a weapon and cut off the flaming vines. She thought that it was necessary to stop the spread of fire by any means. The wind blew Arlaune's hair. Sweat flowed down her face. After a while, Arlaune exhaled heavily. Arlaune looked around and thought that there wasn't much vegetation around her. It was good that she was gradually eating it up. The crown of one of the trees was engulfed in flames. Arlaune held a weapon in her vines and thought that the sparks from the fire spread too far. The crowns of the trees were all charred and falling to the ground. Arlaune thought that several trees had already burned to the ground. Arlaune closed her eyes and leaned her hand against her chest. Then she thought it was good that she had managed to pull herself together and quickly cope with the spread of fire. The next moment, a burning tree fell in front of Arlaune. She was very scared. Arlaune frowned. She looked away as she heard someone's footsteps. Arlaune heard a loud rustling in the bushes. Then she noticed another surviving Minotaur that was trying to escape. The Minotaur began to run away quickly. Arlaune, without hesitation, took one of the axes into the vine and threw it towards the fleeing monster. As soon as the axe disappeared into the forest, a loud noise was heard and silence fell over the saddle. Arlaune looked at the forest thicket and waited. Arlaune held a weapon in her vines. She looked down and thought that the monster had really managed to escape. She still wondered why they appeared in her forest. Arlaune remembered the stone city and the high fortress. She looked down and thought that there was a place nearby where the front line between the kingdom and the army of the demon lord runs. Maybe the Minotaurs were going there. Arlaune put her hand to her lips. She remembered the fleeing monster and thought that she hoped that the escape of the Minotaur would not bring trouble. The crowns of the once lush trees burned to the ground. Arlaune thought that she hoped not to meet the army of the demon lord anymore. Arlaune began to move her vines and carefully collect the trusted insects in the nearby area. Arlaune built a grave, on which she placed a flower with teeth. Arlaune joined her hands together and began to think that she was sorry to the insects for not being able to protect them. Arlaune began to smile and look up. Unharmed butterflies and bees flew around her. who began to help her sort out the territory. Arlaune thanked them for their help. Arlaune looked in front of her and thought that she understood the insects. It was time for them to return to their nest. She would miss them. Then Arlaune exhaled heavily and looked up. She imagined white feathers falling from the sky and thought that she had not seen a white bird for a long time. The white bird first sat and looked forward, then the bird flew up and brought a flower in its beak. Arlaune reflected that she had not seen the white bird for a long time. Arlaune had already begun to miss her, although at first the bird annoyed her a little. Arlaune looked up. She folded her arms on her chest and thought that she did not know what to do. She could not wait to meet the white bird. At this time, her heart was even restless. Arlaune imagined herself smiling and a white bird next to her. She thought that she would like to hear the singing of a white bird. Arlaune is even ready to help the bird fly. When they are close, they can sing together. There were several one-story houses on the hilly terrain, with bars on the windows and a dense forest spread behind. In front of the houses, which were built on a hilly area, a large stick with a lot of wood and hay was erected. The man was leading Ruth on a rope and saying that she was a witch and this was her last day. Ruth saw several armed men in front of her, glaring at her. Ruth wondered if magicians had been sent to the soldiers. They must have come from the capital of the kingdom. Ruth saw a wooden pole in front of her, around which there were many pieces of wood and hay. She thought that the magicians had been sent here to oversee her execution. Ruth's hands were tied, and she was walking down a corridor of soldiers. Ruth was very surprised when she heard some kind of fuss in front of her. Ruth and everyone around her looked up in surprise. There was a bright sky above the people, with clouds floating over them. All people were surprised by the fact that there were two bright suns in the sky. Ruth's face was red. She was looking up enthusiastically. The rays of the sun illuminated her face. Everyone around began to shout that a second sun had appeared in the sky. Ruth was standing there, her hands tied, and she was looking up enthusiastically. The people around her began to nervously say that it was getting too hot. The demon lord was to blame for this phenomenon. The light was getting brighter. Ruth imagined Arlaune's happy face. She was smiling broadly, her hair blowing in the wind, and her arms were spread apart. Ruth's hands were tied, and she stared intently at the hands of the man who was holding the rope. Ruth clenched her hands into fists and thought that she felt somehow anxious. She had to come to Arlaune's aid. The next moment, Ruth is in the air above the soldiers. The soldiers did not expect such an act from Ruth and were greatly surprised. The soldiers held spears in their hands and started shouting that the witch was escaping. Ruth was in the air. Then she landed on one of the branches of a tree. Her hands were still tied, so as not to fall. Ruth held on to a tree branch and stared ahead in surprise. Ruth held on to a tree branch and watched as large trees began to rise out of the ground, along with their roots into the air. Seeing trees with roots in the air, Arlaune was very surprised. She looked in front of her and then began to sharply inspect the area around her. There were beads of sweat on Ruth's face. Ruth was sitting on a tree and holding onto a branch with her hands tied. Whole trees were floating in the air in front of her, which were completely engulfed in flames. The heat of the fire was so intense that in a short time the trees were completely burned down. Ruth turned in the direction from which she had heard the loud sound. The sun was shining brightly in the sky, and an unusual silhouette with wings appeared next to it. More and more beads of sweat trickled down on Ruth's face. She looked in surprise at the sudden appearance of a bright figure with wings. A gusty wind abruptly appeared in the air, which began to blow towards Arlaune. Arlaune raised her hand and nervously thought that the sun was getting hotter. No, a second sun had appeared. This was something incredible. Arlaune didn't understand what was going on. In the air, above the crowns of the lush trees, a flaming silhouette of a dragon appeared. His wings were huge. There was an unusual object on his head and horns. Arlaune leaned her hand against her chest and looked up. A hurricane-force wind began to rise above the lush crowns of the trees. Arlaune began to think that she felt uncomfortable because it was very hot, even though it was only spring. Two suns appeared in the sky, through which fluffy clouds floated. Arlaune blushed. She began to cover her face with her hand and look up, while she thought that something strange was happening, how two suns could appear in the sky. One sun began to increase. Then it began to disperse and turned into an incomprehensible substance. Arlaune covered her face with her hand and thought that, as far as she remembers, there is only one sun in this world, but how can the sun begin to move? The next moment, a loud explosion appeared in the sky, where the second sun was located. Bright rays of light illuminated everything around. The brightest flash of light illuminated Arlaune and everything around her. She held her hand out in front of her and closed her eyes. After a while, she opened her eyes, tears streaming from them, and began to look at the sky. The second sun in the sky has disappeared. Arlaune looked down. Beads of sweat were running down her face. She thoughtfully put her hand to her lips and thought that last summer she had already seen something similar, the same moving mass of light. Arlaune remembered the toothy monsters and the white bird that sat on a branch. Arlaune thought that on that very day she fought off a group of monster monkeys, and in the evening, on the same day, she met the white bird for the first time. Arlaune remembered a bright flash with wings. She began to think that this object she saw looked like a flaming fireball. Arlaune lowered her head. She remembered herself in the past. At that moment she was sweating and covering her face with her hand from the light. Then Arlaune thought that the next day after the incident there was a terrible heat wave. Could it really happen again? Arlaune looked at the dense forest in front of her and began to think that this changeable spring weather reminded her of that incident. Suddenly, among the lush crowns of the trees, there is a loud noise and a bright flash of light appears, which illuminated everything around. Following the sound and the flash of light, a strong wind appears in the air, which began to rush at Arlaune and her flower. Particles of earth and dust rose into the air, as well as Arlaune vines began to develop in the gusty wind. As soon as the wind stopped, Arlaune looked up and saw how strange smoke began to emanate from the lush crowns of the trees. Trees with roots and branches began to rise into the air. An unusual silhouette appeared against the background of the sun, which shone very brightly. The silhouette hovered in the air above the lush crowns of the trees. Then the silhouette began to turn into a shapeless object and shine even brighter. A moment later, there was a huge explosion, and the shapeless object had wings. A gusty wind rose from the resulting explosion. The strongest gusts of wind and fiery tongues of flame fell towards where Arlaune was standing with her flower. She began to cover her face with her hands. There were drops of sweat on Arlaune's face. She held her hand to her lips and nervously reflected that the force that had arisen was not just a flame. This force was even something more than a magical attack. Arlaune's hair was blowing in the wind. Arlaune wondered who could have made such an attack when she was a saint. She had never seen anything like it. The next moment, Arlaune nervously looked down. She saw the part of her flower had been attacked by an unusual creature. The Arlaune flower was attacked by an unknown creature. Dark smoke emanated from the flower. Arlaune looked at the flower and horror gradually appeared in her gaze. Everything went dark in Arlaune's eyes. She didn't know what to do. Arlaune began to beg for help. The next moment, water is poured over Arlaune. She did not expect the sudden appearance of water and abruptly squeezed her eyes shut. The dark smoke that came from the mouth of the Arlaune flower disappeared. Arlaune's face turned red. She was all wet, and Arlaune's mouth opened slightly in surprise. The water droplets in the air flickered. Arlaune looked at her flower and saw that it had stopped smoking and was almost fine. The next moment, not far from Arlaune, a large bucket falls. The remains of the water that was in the bucket poured onto the ground. Arlaune began to stare intently at the bucket that was lying on the ground not far from her. Arlaune nervously looked at the bucket and thought that where the water came from, was she really saved? Who had saved her this time? Arlaune looks up and outlines the bird. There was a white bird in the air, not far from Arlaune. The wings of the white bird were wide open, and Arlaune was very glad to see her. The bird hovered in the air for a while. Then it landed neatly on a wooden bucket that had once been filled with water. The Arlaune flower was slightly damaged, and the Arlaune vines enveloped it from all sides. Arlaune was carefully watching the bird that was sitting on the bucket. Arlaune was all in the water. She began to smile and sincerely thank the bird for its help. Arlaune reflected that the bird had specially flown in with a bucket of water to save her. Water was running down Arlaune's face and body. Arlaune smiled and began to wonder how the bird got here at all. Was she really the only one who could bring such a heavy bucket of water on her own? A white bird sat on a bucket and spread its wings to the sides. Without hesitation, the bird took off. Arlaune thought that she couldn't have imagined it. She clearly heard someone calling her. Arlaune looked at the bird in surprise when she said that she could have been seen when she flew here, for which she apologizes. A white bird flew very close to Arlaune and said that Arlaune should hide as soon as possible. Arlaune looked in surprise at the bird approaching her. She held her hands on the petals. There was a dense forest around Arlaune and the bird. Arlaune opened her eyes wide and opened her eyes wide and opened her mouth slightly. She was very surprised and listened attentively to the white bird. The bird was flying in the air and said that Arlaune should act before they came here. Arlaune makes a very surprised face. She blushed in an instant and opened her mouth very wide. Arlaune wondered if her bird had learned to speak. Arlaune put one hand to her face, touched her hair with the other. Then she nervously began to say that the bird was really learning to speak. A white bird landed on one of the petals of an Arlaune flower and said that she apologized to Arlaune for having to hide it from her for too long. Arlaune listened attentively to what the bird would say. Sweat was running down Arlaune's face. Arlaune looked anxiously at the bird, which said that this was not what was important now. There were tree branches behind Arlaune. Arlaune had her hands on her petals, and a white bird was also sitting on them. Arlaune looked at the bird and nervously asked that she was wondering who should come here. The white bird looked down. It opened its beak slightly and said that someone from the army of demons should come here. Arlaune anxiously repeated to herself the bird's words about the army of demons. The petals of the Arlaune flower twinkled in the light, and a white bird was sitting on them, which began to say that in any case it was very dangerous. Arlaune was too big. The bird would not be able to carry her away, so Arlaune should immediately hide. After hearing the words, Arlaune frowned. She nervously looked at the white bird sitting on the petals and thought that, why does the bird speak a human language? Can it really understand human speech? Arlaune reflected that she did not believe the bird's words. She could not believe that she was talking to someone who had saved her life so many times. After thinking for a while, Arlaune reached out her hand to the white bird. Arlaune did not have time to touch the bird, as a very loud sound rang out throughout the neighborhood. When Arlaune heard him, she was very scared. The white bird continued to sit on the petals of Arlaune. Arlaune abruptly leaned her arms against herself and, together with the white bird, looked in the direction from which the loud sound was coming. A gusty wind began to rise above the lush crowns of the trees. Arlaune thought anxiously that the noise was already too close. Then Arlaune started shouting that the bird should fly away immediately. The white bird looked at Arlaune and called her. Arlaune looked at the bird and replied that the bird did not need to worry, as it intended to hide. Arlaune's face turned red. She raised her hand and looked at the bird affectionately. Then Arlaune said that she thanked the bird for warning her about the danger. They would definitely see each other again. The bird was carefully studying Arlaune. After thinking for a while, the white bird flapped its wings and flew up. Arlaune kept her hands on her waist and stared after the flying bird. The bird hovered in the air, flapping its wings and looking at the ground where Arlaune was. Ruth's translucent silhouette appeared next to the white bird. Ruth and the white bird were looking down. Ruth's face was slightly red. She began to think that Arlaune must definitely survive, and then she would return to pour water on Arlaune. Arlaune looked up attentively. The white bird turned around and began to fly further and further away from the place where Arlaune was. The bird was floating in the air, and Arlaune turned away from it and looked at the ground. Then Arlaune began to launch her vines into the ground. Arlaune ordered the thorned vines to sink as deep into the ground as possible. Arlaune reflected that, as a last resort, she could retreat to hide in the ground, which is the easiest option in this situation. Arlaune raised her head and looked at the crowns of the trees, which were all in thick smoke. Arlaune looked at the flames and smoke. Then she thought that she had no time left. She would not be able to quickly dig a hole to hide in it. Arlaune decided to hide in a cocoon, which she will make from her vines. Arlaune spread her arms out to the sides and gradually began to wrap herself in a multitude of vines. Arlaune turned out to be completely shrouded in vines. There was a clean area around her, which was surrounded by forest. Arlaune began to peek through the vines and think that she was not hiding at all. She hoped that the enemies would think of her as a plant. A loud noise gradually began to approach in the direction where Arlaune was hiding in her cocoon of vines. Arlaune sat quietly and watched the situation through a small crack in the vines. Arlaune frowned sharply. She began to think that when she was a saint, she defeated the leader of the army of the Demon King, but the battle was so hard that she could not believe that she could survive. Arlaune imagined darkness and an unusual bright light. She reflected that now an unusual being stood in front of her, much larger and more powerful, such a being that turns everything around her into a blazing summer. This creature was a fire dragon. The dragon had an unusual decoration and horns on its head. Its mouth was open and sharp teeth protruded from it. An incredible heat radiated from the dragon. When the dragon moved, its clawed paws made the ground shake. Seeing the dragon and its clawed paws, Arlaune staggered back in fright. Arlaune pulled away from the crack in the vines. She behaved very quietly and gradually began to wrap herself in large petals. Arlaune was in a cocoon of vines. She wrapped herself in large flower petals and covered her ears with her hands and squeezed her eyes shut. Arlaune was shuddered by a loud crash. Beads of sweat were running down her face. She put her hands together and said to herself that she was really asking for this to be over. The dragon was standing next to the cocoon in which Arlaune was hiding. The dragon opened its wings wide and began to call Arlaune. Hearing the dragon's call, Arlaune opened her eyes wide. She waited for what would happen to her next. The dragon looked at Arlaune's cocoon and began to say that Arlaune should stop hiding and should immediately show herself to him. Arlaune stared in front of her, then she squeezed her eyes shut. After thinking a little, Arlaune began to untangle her vines and climb out of the large flower petals. Her belt was sacred, and beads of sweat could be seen on her stomach. Arlaune appeared to the dragon. He loomed over her and began to say that Arlaune was really very beautiful. The dragon's mouth was slightly open. Sharp teeth were sticking out of it, and flames were coming from its body. Arlaune recalled the battle with several Minotaurs. She thought that at that time she still believed in her victory. She was also ready to fight so as not to become a slave. Arlaune looked up anxiously. A huge dragon loomed over her. Arlaune thought that now she did not see any chance of victory. The dragon opened its mouth and drool began to flow from it. The dragon fell asleep on Arlaune and said that she smells very good. The dragon's wings were spread wide and heat and thick smoke emanated from it. Arlaune was trembling all over. Her mouth was parted in fear, and tears began to flow from Arlaune's eyes. There was a dark and thick fog around Arlaune. The dragon stood over Arlaune, flames coming from it. The dragon went on to say that the scent of honey comes from Arlaune's eyes. Arlaune is not only beautiful, but also literally looks like a monster plant. The dragon opened its mouth. It began to lick its lips. Drool began to drip from the dragon's mouth. As soon as they hit the ground, everything around began to melt. Seeing what was happening, Arlaune was scared. Arlaune looked at the burning earth and thought that the dragon's saliva could really burn. The dragon approached Arlaune a little more. Seeing this, Arlaune jerked in fright. Flames and thick smoke were coming from the dragon. He looked at Arlaune and said that he had finally got here. He did not want to stay in this place for long, so it was better for him to get right to the point. Arlaune didn't understand what the dragon wanted from her. Arlaune raised her hands. She looked at the dragon carefully and thought that the dragon really had an errand for her. In that case, there was a chance that she would persuade him to leave this place. Arlaune hesitantly introduced herself to the dragon. The dragon got angry. He loomed over Arlaune and said that he had heard that she had dealt with his very important subordinate. Arlaune nervously looked at the dragon and listened to him. Arlaune looked at the dragon and wondered how she could deal with the subordinate of the fire dragon. Flames enveloped everything around. Arlaune started saying that the dragon was wrong. The dragon started talking about the Minotaurs. Arlaune thought about it and remembered how she had missed one of the surviving Minotaurs. The dragon began to say that Arlaune should not hide the truth. The surviving Minotaur himself told him about what happened. Arlaune looked at the flaming dragon and wondered if those Minotaurs were subordinates of the fire dragon, if this dragon was a Grushvans from the army of the Lord of Darkness. Arlaune looked at the dragon and imagined a Minotaur with one eye. The dragon went on to say that he had a botanical garden. He sent Minotaurs to find rare plants for him. The Minotaur with one eye was named Dikov. The dragon continued to hover over Arlaune and talk about all the Minotaurs she had dealt with. Arlaune anxiously watched and listened to the dragon. The dragon looked at Arlaune and kept saying that they had forgotten about the original task that the dragon had set them. They were wonderful wars, and now the dragon wants to avenge them. The dragon did not have time to finish, as he abruptly opens his toothy mouth and begins to spew flames all over the area. The dragon opens its mouth wide, and flames begin to come out of it, which aim towards Arlaune. Arlaune thought fearfully that she might burn like that. Then she starts screaming that the dragon has to stop. Arlaune puts her hands on her chest and starts shouting that the dragon should taste her nectar. The dragon should definitely like it. The dragon silently looked at Arlaune, and she thought that she needed to buy some time, and then she would come up with a way out of this situation. Arlaune picks up one of his vines. She begins to lick the tip of the vine. Nectar appears on it. Then Arlaune holds out a vine with nectar to the dragon. The dragon warily watches Arlaune's actions, his eyes burning brightly. The dragon tastes Arlaune's nectar and says he didn't think the plant would have the sense to beg for its life. After the dragon tasted the nectar, he was very surprised. Everything starts to flicker. The dragon joyfully begins to say that Arlaune nectar is very sweet. You want to try it again and again. It's definitely worth thinking about Arlaune's fate again. Arlaune raises his hand and, with a smile on his face, thinks that the dragon really liked the nectar. The dragon started looking around and said he could put Arlaune in his bed. The sun was shining brightly. The dragon said that he would look at Arlaune when he woke up and would have breakfast with her nectar. He was interested in Arlaune's agreement. She smiled and nervously imagined agreeing to the dragon's proposal. While Arlaune was thinking, the dragon abruptly approached her and asked where she had put the bodies of his fallen soldiers. Arlaune is all gloomy and remembers how she fed all the defeated Minotaurs to her flower. Flames were coming from the dragon. Nearby, monster armor was piled in the bushes. Arlaune and the dragon discussed that Arlaune buried the monsters on her own. Arlaune was very nervous, and the dragon was opening its mouth. The dragon looked at the mouth of the Arlaune flower and said that the mouth of the flower was too big because it feeds on flesh. Arlaune frowned and lowered her head. Then she thought that the dragon really knows everything. She needs to figure out how to proceed. The dragon began to flap its wings, and a gusty wind with dust particles began to appear in the air. Arlaune tried to justify herself, but the dragon began to interrupt her. The dragon began to wave its tail, at the tip of which a flame appeared. A fireball separated from the tail. The dragon viciously said that most likely Arlaune was deceiving him and she just ate the bodies of his soldiers. The fireball hit the toothy mouth of the Arlaune flower. She started looking at her flower very scared. There were sweat stains on Arlaune's face. The dragon began to walk on the spot. Then he viciously said that the blue flame that appeared on the flower was impossible. It was created with the help of magic, and the water was powerless here. The toothy mouth of the Arlaune flower began to smoke. The dragon said that he controls the power of fire so that it spreads slowly and devours everything around. Arlaune asked the dragon to stop. The demon began to turn around and say that he had other things to do, and that would be the end of their communication. In the next instant, the dragon turned into a white speck with wings and flew up. Arlaune looked up where the dragon had flown. Smoke was coming from the Arlaune flower. Arlaune began to look around nervously and think that if this continues, the whole forest, she and her friends, will burn down. She urgently needs to come up with something. Arlaune looked in front of her and saw how the crowns of lush trees were engulfed in flames. Everything turned out to be an acrid smoke. Arlaune was looking up, dark smoke coming from the mouth of her flower. Arlaune thought that this year, which she had lived like a flower, was like a bonus stage. Maybe if she thought like that, it would become much easier for her. Everything was on fire. Arlaune stared in front of her. Her face turned red and her eyes began to fill with tears. Arlaune thought that it was wrong to think like that because she was still alive. Darkness and white flashes appeared in front of Arlaune's eyes. She started to think that she didn't want to die. It was very scary. Arlaune abruptly closed her eyes as something crashed into her face. She looked at her hand and wondered if it was really a seed. How did it end up here? Arlaune looked into the blazing thicket of the forest and began to think that it was a banksia seed. She saw it as in that botany book when she was still a schoolgirl. On a small branch there were seeds in a strong shell. Arlaune thought that fire is usually a disaster for plants, but banksia thrives in fire. The heat bursts the hard fruits and the seed is released outside. The mouth of the Arlaune flower continued to burn. Arlaune joined her hands and squeezed her eyes shut. Then she began to think that if she became the same plant, she would easily get out of this place. Realizing what Arlaune had said, she began to think that there was a way of pollination when the stamens and pistils of the same plant pollinate each other. Arlaune imagined the branches of a plant with small flowers. She thought that if she pollinated herself, then her offspring would be able to inherit all her features. Fire was coming from the mouth of the flower, and everything around Arlaune was blazing. Arlaune thought that this was just her hypothesis. She should save her offspring by any means, let them live in her place. The seed began to glow. Arlaune imagined herself in a bright light, lying with her eyes closed and her hands on her chest. Arlaune thought that this option would be much better than not trying anything and burning to the ground. Arlaune clasped her hands together and looked sadly at the bottom. Then she thought that she had already made a decision. She needed to self-pollinate. Beads of sweat were running down Arlaune's face. She smiled nervously and thought that all her thoughts were just a hypothesis. Arlaune imagined the sprouted seed and thought that if Arlaune, who would grow from her seed, continued to live in her place, it was much better than not trying anything and burning to the ground. Arlaune looked down at the bottom. She was full of determination and thought that she had already decided everything. It remains only to act. A vine appeared next to Arlaune, on which a small flower grew. It gradually began to bloom. Arlaune held her hands out in front of her and thought that now she would do self-pollination. Arlaune picked up a blooming flower and leaned it against her face, which was red. The next moment, Arlaune's stomach swelled sharply, and she looked at him in surprise. Arlaune put her hands on her swollen belly. Arlaune held her hands on her swollen stomach. She closed her eyes and began to emit a bright light that illuminated everything around her. Arlaune closed her eyes, beads of sweat dripping down her face. After a while, everything around Arlaune went dark, and she thought that most likely she was losing consciousness. Before losing consciousness, Arlaune imagined a beautiful flower, people with nature and her toothy flower. Then she wondered if her memories of past lives would be preserved or not. Arlaune leaned back, her eyes were closed and her hair was disheveled. She reflected that her name was Arlaune and she was a monster who just wanted to live a quiet life, producing oxygen. In the pitch darkness, a small seed appeared. It began to emit the brightest light, which scattered the darkness around it. There was a sky above the treetops, through which clouds floated. The fire stopped spreading and completely went out. There were only stubs left on the ground. When Arlaune came to her senses, she noticed that a new one had finally appeared. Arlaune looked down and thought she saw the familiar crown of the waist and the onion. She remembered herself as a schoolgirl and how she became a saint. She looked up at the sky, where fluffy clouds were floating. Arlaune reflected that her hypothesis was confirmed. She was able to come out of this hopeless situation as a diva. Little Arlaune clenched her hands into fists, then she opened her mouth slightly. Little Arlaune began to rejoice. She raised her hands up, her face was red. Arlaune began to cheerfully shout that she was very glad that she had succeeded. Arlaune held her hands up and thought that she had really become a little daughter now. Arlaune's face was red and very happy. Arlaune looked at her flower and thought that it was really true. She had just sprouted from a seed. She was still a sprout of Arlaune. Soon she should grow again. Arlaune imagined white petals on flowers. She put her hand to her face and thought that she needed water for further growth. Little Arlaune looked around and thought that the soil had dried up from the fire, so it was impossible to get water from there. It had only sprouted, and he can already die again. Everything was black with fire. Arlaune began to look around and think that someone could help her in this situation. Arlaune noticed that someone was watching her. She raised her head up and said she didn't understand what it was so small. Arlaune looked up and saw a girl with long blonde hair floating in the air in front of her. It was Ruth, who looked at little Arlaune in response. Ruth floated in the air and looked at little Arlaune. Then she started saying that Arlaune was so small, it was definitely her. Ruth definitely didn't confuse anything. Ruth floated in the air. Arlaune stared at her face and thought that the girl had such white hair and a black robe, who she really was. Then Arlaune remembered the image of this girl, which belonged to the first Minotaur. Ruth continued to hover in the air. Arlaune watched her actions with a serious expression on her face and thought that the photo that the Minotaur had was not a grandmother, but a girl. Was she really an enemy of the Minotaurs? Ruth stared intently at Arlaune. After thinking a little, she turned around and said that Ruth did not recognize Arlaune. Since she had changed a lot, Arlaune should wait for Ruth. She will be back soon. Ruth flew towards the mountains and the burned-down forest. Arlaune stared after Ruth in surprise. Vines with thorns surrounded Arlaune from all sides. A slight blush appeared on Arlaune's face. She was very surprised when she saw a white bird flying towards her, carrying a bucket in its paws. Arlaune looked at the white bird and realized that she recognized it. Arlaune's face turned even redder. She put her hand on her chest and enthusiastically looked at the flying bird. Arlaune thought she was very glad that the bird was all right. A white bird was flying in the air. She also held a bucket in her paws. Arlaune thought that the bird was flying strangely. Instead of flapping its wings, it seemed to be soaring. After a while, a white bird flew up to Arlaune and put a bucket behind the ground. Arlaune looked at the bird with delight. The bird put the bucket on the ground. Arlaune began to scream that it was really the bird itself. The bird started saying that she was apologizing to Arlaune as she did not want to deceive Arlaune. A moment later, instead of a bird, Ruth appears in the air. An unusual dark aura emanated from her. The face of a white-haired girl, Ruth, appeared in front of Arlaune. Arlaune made a surprised expression on her face and thought that her bird had really turned into a human. Ruth found herself on the ground. She stood in front of Arlaune and said that this was her real form. There was a bucket next to Ruth. Little Arlaune said that really Ruth is a human, and she can also turn into a bird. Ruth lowered her head and said she wasn't really human. Ruth raised her head and timidly said that she was actually a witch. Arlaune's mouth opened wide in surprise. Arlaune looked in front of her and thought that when she was a saint, witches were enemies of people. That's what the church had taught her. Arlaune imagined a large armed army and thought that witches possessed magic. To find a witch, the state was gathering an army. Arlaune presented a creepy picture. She tensed up and thought that saints and witches are considered opposites. But now, Arlaune is not a saint, so witches are no longer enemies for her. Ruth looked at Arlaune in silence. Then she started walking to Arlaune and said that Arlaune had grown up here, so Ruth was wrong to hope that Arlaune would understand her. The bucket was standing behind Ruth. She started saying that she used to be a human, but at the age of 6 she became a witch. She never contacted other witches. Ruth always lived with her parents, but recently they were gone. Arlaune listened attentively to Ruth's story. Ruth went on to say that sometime after this incident she found Arlaune here. Arlaune put her hand to her face. Then she looked at Ruth's sad face and thought that she had never heard of people becoming witches before. It was unlikely that Ruth was trying to deceive Arlaune. Ruth was standing a few meters away from Arlaune. Arlaune looked at Ruth and thought that Ruth often turned into a bird and flew to her to help. But why did Ruth do this? Arlaune stared in front of her in surprise. Then she imagined herself in a cauldron of hot liquid. Arlaune thought maybe Ruth wanted to use it as an ingredient. Arlaune pulled away from Ruth a little. Ruth began to say that she met Arlaune for the first time when she was fighting with monkeys. Then Arlaune was so brave and strong. Ruth remembered the adult Arlaune and said that she had never seen such plants before. Ruth was full of hope that now Arlaune would understand her. Ruth went over to Arlaune and sat down for a while. Then she said that Arlaune wouldn't mind if Ruth took her for herself. Ruth looked at Arlaune and said that she would take care of Arlaune and water her. Arlaune held out her hand in front of her for fear that Ruth wanted to cook it. Ruth stood in front of Arlaune and said that she did not like people, but Arlaune was not a human being. Ruth would trust her. Arlaune thought it all sounded kinda sad. Ruth put her hand on her chest and said that she had been caring for Arlaune all year. Ruth began to tell me how she took care of Arlaune. Arlaune remembered wrapping herself in her petals. Ruth continued that this was why Arlaune would be much better off with her. Arlaune refused Ruth's offer. Ruth sat down and angrily said that it was not worth talking about the fact that Arlaune was already almost hers. Arlaune began to think that she did not want to become a pet flower. She loved freedom. Ruth stood by and looked at Arlaune. After thinking a little, Ruth asks what Arlaune might want to drink. Arlaune raised her hands to the top and started shouting that she really wanted water. Arlaune began to act up and think that Ruth was deliberately teasing her. Ruth sat down by the bucket and dipped her hand into it. Arlaune watched in surprise. Arlaune saw a burn scar on Ruth's arm. She was wondering how Ruth got that scar. Ruth's hands were on the bucket. Arlaune began to remember how the bird used to take care of her. Arlaune thought that Ruth had risked her life for her more than once. Ruth plaintively said that she didn't want to be alone anymore. Arlaune asked why she had to hover next to Ruth. Ruth replied that she had no one else left. Arlaune listened attentively to Ruth, who said that when she gets lonely, she tries to help someone. That's how she found Arlaune. Arlaune pursed her lips. She imagined a flower and a book falling. Arlaune thought that Ruth was as lonely as Arlaune herself. Arlaune thought a little and remembered herself as a little girl. She had dark hair with a flower clip on it. Arlaune was an ordinary schoolgirl with whom no one was friends, but then she was reborn into a saint. The girl with blonde hair was surrounded by many people. It was a saint who stopped being alone. Arlaune foamed that when she was a saint, she was betrayed and then she became a flower. She continued to be lonely. She waited for comfort from anyone, as long as someone was already with her. Ruth looked at Arlaune and began to say that even though Arlaune was a flower, she was the most important thing in Ruth's life right now, and she didn't care about the rest. There was a bright light coming from Ruth. Arlaune looked at her carefully and thought that it seemed to her that there was no one else in the world who needed her. Arlaune looked in front of her and thought that if she did not open up to Ruth, then she would have another such chance, but she did not want to be completely alone. Ruth stood her ground and said she was begging Arlaune to come with her. Little Arlaune's thorned vines were wobbling on the ground. After thinking for a while, Arlaune lifted her vines with thorns up. Ruth looked in front of her in surprise and saw how little Arlaune's hands began to reach out to her. Arlaune spread her arms wide and lifted several of her thorned vines. She waited for Ruth to hug her. Arlaune's face was red with embarrassment. She held out her hands to Ruth and said that she should introduce herself to her. Ruth looked at Arlaune in confusion. Ruth and Arlaune's hands joined. They held each other tightly. Ruth's arms were wearing sleeves with unusual cuffs. Little Arlaune ended up in a bucket. Ruth said it was good that she had thought to bring a bucket with her. This bucket suits Arlaune very well. Arlaune was sitting in the pot and thought that she was very uncomfortable, but the water washed the roots very pleasantly. Ruth stood next to him, looking at Arlaune with a smile on her face. A shimmer appeared in the air around the girls. Ruth said that the Demon Lord's army knows about this place. For some reason, they are targeting Ruth. Arlaune thought that now it was clear how the monster had got the photo of Ruth. Mountains and forest were visible next to the girls. Ruth said she wanted to go back to her village, but it burned down. She doesn't want to live in the city because of the people. Arlaune thought that the forest had burned down. She could try to go live with people. Ruth began to transform into a white bird. Then she said that people could find out about her transformations. The bird was carried by Arlaune, who thought that levitation and transformation, apparently Ruth specializes in this. The girls began to reason that not all witches fly on broomsticks. Ruth, in the form of a white bird, began to take off, with Arlaune in her paws. Ruth, in the form of a white bird, began to rise higher and higher. Arlaune decided to look into them. Her face turned red, and her mouth opened in surprise. Arlaune was sitting in a wooden bucket held by Ruth in the form of a white bird and flying forward. Arlaune looked around carefully. Arlaune looked down and thought that the forest had completely disappeared. Only the cleared land remained. Now she understands how strange the fire was. Arlaune looked at the remains of the trees and thought that she hoped that everyone had survived, especially her bees. She would like to meet him again. Then Arlaune looked up as Ruth called her. Ruth, in the form of a bird, looked at Arlaune and said that a fair wind was good for them, wasn't it? Arlaune looked at the bird in embarrassment. Ruth sat down next to Arlaune, and they started holding hands. Arlaune thought that this was how, a year later, she would now live with Ruth. A monster plant that cannot live alone. The girl, Alraune, and Ruth, a witch who doesn't trust people. They decided to band together and start a life together, and right now they were in search of their new home together. Recently, Iris felt someone's eyes on her, watching her without interruptions. She was nervous, suspecting that someone might be watching them. The stern eagle watched the movements of Ruth and Alraune, but at one point it turned around and flew away from her. The girl understood that it was incredibly easy to do on them, however, she did nothing, and this remained a question for her. Suddenly, Ruth quietly told Alraune that they needed to get down as quickly as possible. The black earth formed as a result of the forest fire ended, and the forest began to spread out again under them. It was as if some supernatural force was at work there. The boundary between the forest and the burned-out area ended in a straight line. Alraune stared at it all in amazement. From afar, they saw the city of towers, and it seemed to them as if it was very close. Ruth landed slowly in the forest, then quickly put the bucket of Alraune on the ground. Immediately after that, Ruth took her usual form and said that perhaps this would be enough because she was very tired. Alraune continued to admire. Together, they were in a forest with incredibly tall trees. They looked at everything around them, keeping silence. Ruth took off her raincoat and quietly said that she was hungry. Alraune thought about food and the fact that they needed food, clothes, and shelter for a good life. She looked at the little witch and thought that, first of all, they should provide themselves with food. Alraune wondered what a human child should do in such a case. Suddenly, Iris noticed that Ruth was staring at her intently. Alraune asked what was wrong, and the witch admitted that she had always been interested in finding out what the taste of nectar was like for a girl. Alraune was very surprised. Ruth quickly approached and said that Alraune herself knows that both monsters and children are just crazy about the girl's nectar, and therefore the witch would also like to try it. She asked if she could do it. Almost immediately after that, she ran her finger through Alraune's mouth, amazed at such insolence. The girl put her finger in her mouth, after which she was extremely surprised. She said admiringly that she did not even know that there was something so delicious in the world. Ruth looked at Alraune and said that she wanted more, but the girl quickly refused and said that she could no longer. She understood that if this continued, the girl would become addicted to nectar. Ruth looked at Alraune and said that she only needed to collect nectar from her flowers, and therefore the girl should not be angry with her. In fact, Iris wasn't angry. Suddenly, something caught the girl's attention. She noticed that Ruth's burns were gradually healing. The girl was very surprised and looked at her hands, after which she said in surprise that this was true. Then Alraune said that her nectar has a restorative effect. Ruth was surprised and exclaimed that it was just amazing. She told Alraune that she was special, after all. The girl smiled, thinking that the witch should not be so surprised because she is even more special. Her white bird, which has been helping Alraune cope with loneliness for so long. Iris thought about the moment when she first found out that her bird was a witch who uses the magic of transformation and levitation. Alraune paused for a moment. Afterwards, she said that she was very surprised. Right after that, she suggested the idea to Ruth, and the girl agreed, saying that they really needed to find something to eat. Alraune thought that Ruth had filled a bucket of water before they went out, but according to the girl, it was already drying out, and now it was the growing season. The very next moment, Ruth turned back into a bird. She took Alraune with her, and together they set off again. They continued flying until they found a lake, where they stopped. Alraune happily said that this is an extremely large body of water. Ruth agreed, but noted the fact that the water in this place is dirty. Alraune looked, thinking that, of course, such water is not worth drinking, especially considering that even the bottom is not visible, but she is a plant, so it does not bother her. Alraune happily said that this water would be suitable and took a small step forward, but Ruth stopped her, because it could be dangerous. The next moment, the girls saw that a small stream of liquid rose from the water. Alraune was surprised. They saw that bubbles appeared in the water quite quickly. Noticing this, Alraune quickly made a dash back and exclaimed that they needed to run. The next moment, a large-sized creature rose from the water. The girls stared at him in amazement. Immediately after that, they were covered by a huge wave. The bucket with Alraune overturned, and she rolled to the side. When the girl stopped, she tried to figure out what was going on and where Rufus was. The little witch was floating in the air at that time. Tears were streaming from Ruth's eyes as she was in pain. She was trying to figure out what had happened and why she couldn't see anything. Iris sighed when she saw that Ruth was at a safe distance. The next moment, the water monster hit the bucket with Alraune, which caused her to roll head over heels across the area. She rolled like that until she fell into the lake. Almost immediately, she saw that the reptiles were heading towards her. The girl recognized them as crocodile-like monsters. It was a glucocoder. Realizing this, Iris noted that their business was bad. The girl understood perfectly well that with such a mouth she would be eaten in one bite. The next moment, Alraune's gaze fell on the mountain of various bones and skeletons that were on the shore. Alraune's face immediately paled. In a panic, the girl thought that she would not let these monsters eat her so easily. She directed her poisonous pollen at them in the hope that it would save her. The crocodile roared loudly. The bucket with Alraune was covered with small waves, which caused it to quickly turn over. Iris found herself in the water. She began to sink to the bottom of the reservoir. Monsters began to gather around the drowning girl. Iris suddenly saw a plant next to her. She wrapped her vine around him. The girl has absorbed an aquatic plant, and now she has new abilities. She could stay in the water longer and not die from lack of oxygen. However, if the crocodiles attack her, it won't help much. The bucket of Alraune continued to sink slowly as the monsters gathered around. Suddenly, one crocodile sank its teeth into another. Alraune looked at them in surprise and wondered if they were really fighting among themselves. She assumed that they were fighting among themselves to decide who would get the loot. The girl thought that if they killed each other, she would be only glad. However, this probably won't happen. At that moment, the bucket began to turn over, and the girl screamed. She quickly began to turn over, because a funnel formed because of the monsters. Alraune screamed in panic. After a few moments, she sighed, not understanding what had happened or where she was. She hadn't seen any crocodiles, and the water in this place was much cleaner. Alraune could see much better. The girl felt like she was floating. She thought that maybe she had drifted into the source that flows out of the lake. She looked at her hands, thinking that this was not good. The girl did not know how far the river went. If no one notices her, she won't see Ruth anymore. The girl desperately prayed for someone to save her. At that moment, some kind of movement began in the water. Suddenly, a large wave threw the bucket with the girl high into the air. Iris flew up with a shocked expression on her face. The vines of Alraune moved quickly, after which the girl fell to the shore nearby. The girl, lying on the ground, moaned in pain and thought that she had failed to successfully moor. She raised her head in disbelief to understand what had happened. In front of the girl, a large frog sat next to the pond and looked directly at the girl. Alraune looked closer and realized that it was a frog-shaped monster, Furtfrush. She noticed that it didn't look aggressive. At that moment, the huge frog screamed, and then quickly headed away from the girl. Alraune thought for a moment, then decided that she did not think that this frog had saved her. Besides, she didn't feel like someone had taken her away from there. The girl thought that this sudden current of water had thrown her into the sky. In her opinion, it was so strange and unusual. She couldn't figure out who had saved her. Alraune had no idea, but it was enough that she just managed to survive. And the girl finally managed to find water and get drunk. She lay down, relaxed, thinking that she was unlucky, but in what way? She thought that now she needed to find Ruth. The girl suddenly came up with something. Iris picked up her vine. The Alraune vine rose high into the air through the trees, straight up to the sky. The girl stretched out her entire vine to appear above the trees. After a few moments, the girl heard someone calling Alraune. She immediately realized that it was Ruth's voice. The girl was very glad that the girl was able to find her. She started to lower her vine back down. At that moment, Ruth shouted at the girl not to take it away. Ruth cried out for Iris to let the vine grow. The girl quickly grabbed the end of the vine, lifting the girl into the air. Alraune was greatly surprised by this. Ruth breathed a sigh of relief, because the girl almost snapped. Alraune rose into the air, then looked at the ground where she had been a few moments ago. There were 2 bears among the trees who were looking at the flying girl. Iris looked at them in shock. She wondered if Ruth was sure it wasn't hard for her. After that, she happily thought about the fact that they were flying to a new place. After some time, the girl stopped in the forest. Alraune looked around and thought that she didn't see any monsters, so it was much safer in this place. She looked at Ruth, who was cold. The girl thought that the girl was all wet and might catch a cold if she stayed like this. Alraune called out to Ruth by name, beckoning the girl closer to her. After that, Ruth got rid of her wet clothes, and Iris wrapped her in her vines, warming her. Ruth said the words that it was strange, but very warm. Iris hoped that the girl was warm enough, because she usually used this vine to catch prey. It was gradually getting dark in the forest. Ruth awkwardly uttered the words that she was really warm. Alraune thought awkwardly that there was one small problem. The girl could feel the touch through the vine. Because of this, she felt warm, and it seemed to her that it made the girl a little uncomfortable. Alraune looked at Ruth carefully, thinking that she was very thin. The girl remembered how the girl had said that her parents were dead. She thought that she must have never been able to live in peace. The girl thought that, for example, even today, Ruth ate only an apple and her honey. She decided that tomorrow she would need to catch her something more nutritious. Iris thought that she would definitely try for Ruth. Suddenly, Ruth sat up, calling out to Alraune. She told the girl that she had gone to bed with the girl. After that, the girls lay down next to each other. Alraune stared at the girl next to her. Alraune thanked the girl for helping her today. Ruth replied that Iris was hers, so there was nothing surprising in that. The girl nodded her head warmly. Iris looked at the girl, thinking that now she could fly anywhere with Ruth. Now revenge on the heroes who betrayed her no longer looked like a dream. However, Alraune thought that she could not involve the girl in her personal affairs. The girl decided that she should not think only about herself. Alraune decided that her goal for the future was to make sure that they could live together as a family. The girl began to think about what they needed for this. She thought of a safe place to sleep and maybe a hot meal. Alraune happily imagined that, in this way, they would be able to create their own paradise. There was an incredibly bright flash in the air, which woke up little Alraune. The girl wiped her eyes and looked at this light in amazement. Then she looked back and saw that there was far more than one such light around. Iris was a little surprised to find that they were fireflies, but she wasn't sure about it. Ruth had woken up by this point and started to untangle herself from the vine. Alraune wiped her eyes sleepily again and asked Ruth what she was doing. Noticing that the little plant had already woken up, the witch wished the girl a good morning. She pulled out one of the vines and said that they were very confused. Alraune stared at Ruth in silence, trying to figure out what kind of dream it was. The girl woke up with an extremely strange feeling. In her mind, she saw a flickering light, much like a firefly. She also felt unbearably thirsty in her sleep. The girl also noted that, if you think about it, she is still very thirsty. Even considering that she was able to drink a lot of water yesterday, she already wants more today, and probably because of her height. The vines shriveled and withered. The girl looked at Ruth and noted that the pond they had seen yesterday was extremely dangerous, and therefore they would have to look for a water source again. At that very moment, a loud sound rang out from the belly of Ruth, who was trying to get out of the vines, which immediately made it clear that the girl was hungry. They ate some apples quickly. Ruth looked at Alraune and said that she wanted some more nectar, but the girl firmly refused to give more. After that, Ruth thought deeply, putting her thumb in her mouth. Noticing this, Iris was quite surprised. She thought it was a cute, childish gesture, but it wouldn't be good if it became a habit. Full of motivation, Alraune decided that, as an older sister, she simply had to warn the girl. She pulled out one of her vines and told Ruth that sucking a finger is not really good and, in principle, very childish behavior. Upon hearing this, Ruth was quite offended by these words. She looked at Alraune, who was also watching the witch at this time. Ruth pointed at herself and stated that she was already 10 years old, after which she asked if Alraune knew how old she was. The girl was a little surprised by this question. At that moment, she herself became interested in finding out what her age was. She was a schoolgirl, 17 years old, a saint, and now she's an Alraune. If you take into account her previous lives, then she is quite a lot of years old. Iris thought even deeper, thinking that it was hard to tell how old she was at the moment. The girl came to the conclusion that she was about a year old as an Alraune. Based on this, the girl said that she was about 1 year old. Upon hearing this, Ruth said that she was already 10 years old. Afterwards, she asked if Alraune understood what that meant. Iris came to the conclusion that they were both children, but Ruth stated that this meant that she was an older sister to the plant. Alraune was quite confused after these words, but Ruth said that it was not worth worrying at all, because judging by the standards of people, Iris was still very small. She smiled broadly and said she would take good care of Alraune. The girl blushed slightly, after which she got angry, thinking that, in fact, she was the eldest. After that, Ruth pointed Alraune at her clothes and asked the girl to check what was in her pockets. Alraune quickly put her vines in her pocket. Right after that, she pulled out a small thorn. Alraune looked at it and asked if it was her food. Ruth agreed and said she found them in the woods yesterday. Alraune understood what Ruth knew about her ability to adopt the qualities of other plants. She thought that it was very sweet that Rufus was collecting things for her that she had never eaten. Iris thanked the girl. Ruth gave Alraune a plant, very similar to moss. It is an insectivorous plant that belongs to the type of torimochi. The tips of the cilia on the leaves secrete mucus, which entangles insects and digests them. This can be useful in a certain situation. The girl wished herself a pleasant appetite, after which she ate the plant. She thought that this should quench her thirst a little. It was pretty quiet in the forest. Ruth looked at the vines and said that this could not solve their problem completely, but it was already something good. Alraune couldn't disagree with that. The girl noted that the little witch was dressed like a savage. She wondered if Ruth was embarrassed by this and if it would be better to use the vine for this. Alraune came a little closer to Ruth and asked the girl if she could continue to live with her in this way. The witch was a little surprised. She blushed and said that if Alraune was referring to her clothes, then it was not a problem. The girl meant food, clothes, and shelter. Besides clothes, they also needed food. Alraune was well aware of the fact that honey alone would not be enough for a child in any case. She thought about fishing and hunting because she would have to try it anyway. Alraune said that they should try to look for food. Ruth was a little surprised by these words. Iris stated that they needed to find some meat. Ruth sighed, realizing that Alraune was referring to the animals. Ruth asked if the frogs would suit them. Alraune was a little surprised by this thought, but realized that now she could probably easily catch a frog, and she had previously heard that they were very tasty. Suddenly, Ruth looked into the forest and said that she already saw one suitable. She pointed Alraune at the frog that was standing right in front of them. The girl was very surprised to recognize this frog. Ruth asked if Alraune knew her. The girl hesitated, then told me that she saw her yesterday and she probably helped her. Iris still didn't know why this frog had helped her then. The girl wondered if this creature had come to her in order to check on the condition of the plant. Alraune turned to the frog and asked if it was the frog she had seen on the lake yesterday. She asked why the frog had come here. At this time, the monster was slowly approaching her. Alraune noticed that the frog was not responding and therefore assumed that she did not understand their language. Noticing that the frog was approaching, Alraune thought that it was scaring her a little. Suddenly, a slippery tongue flew out from the frog's side and headed straight for the girl. The monster wrapped its tongue around Alraune, then quickly pulled her towards it. Head over heels, Ruth and Alraune flew straight into the monster's mouth. Noticing that they were in a rather dangerous position, Alraune quickly pulled her vines to the side and grabbed a tree. Thanks to her actions, she and Ruth hung between a tree and a frog. The girl thought that, apparently, she was mistaken about the help, and this frog is just a voracious monster. Suddenly, she was very surprised. Alraune saw something amazing in the mouth of this frog. She looked closer and noticed that there was a small blue flower near the monster's throat. The situation became more dangerous because the girls continued to hang in the air. Ruth was scared, and Alraune could see that perfectly well. She was sure that the girl had no combat experience, and she, as an older sister, should do everything in her power. Iris decided that she needed to use the ability of the moss that she had eaten recently. She came up with a plan that she would grow cilia on the vine and try to develop a sticky mucus. Perhaps the sticky vines will help Alraune bind this frog. In the blink of an eye, neat eyelashes appeared on her vines. Alraune threw her tentacles into the attack, pinning down the confused frog. The girl grinned, thinking that it was definitely better this way. Suddenly, Ruth called the girl's name. She looked at her hands, which were completely covered with an unpleasant liquid. Ruth asked what kind of sticky thing it was. Alraune was confused and began to apologize to the girl because of these eyelashes, the whole witch was now covered in slime. Looking at the whole situation, Alraune was still able to find something good. She noticed that, it seems, because of this slime, Ruth still managed to get out of the vines. As soon as Ruth got out, Alraune briefly told the girl to run from there as fast as possible. She stated that she needed to go far away. Ruth was very confused when she heard these words. She asked if she had heard everything correctly. Alraune exclaimed that it was so, and the witch just needed to escape from there. Ruth took a quick breath, then gathered all her strength together and turned into a bird, breaking free from the shackles of this unpleasant situation. Alraune was surprised. Alraune looked at how quickly Ruth rose into the sky. The girl did not understand at all what had happened, and really, all this time, from the very beginning, Ruth could just turn into a bird and fly away. At that moment, the frog began to pull Alraune even harder. She made a loud and prolonged sound. The girl lost her balance a little and spun around. Alraune quickly touched the ground, after which even more vines appeared from the ground under her, which the frog's tongue twirled instantly. The cilia on the tentacles secrete a special substance that causes numbness. It affects the frog, which makes it unable to move. Now Alraune had a chance to win. She clenched her hands into a fist, thinking that this frog was to blame for deciding to eat the girls. Immediately after, Alraune used her poisonous pollen. Immediately after that, a huge wave of purple smoke spread across the square, taking out the body of a large frog itself. The monster panted heavily, trying to pull Alraune even harder. The girl also thought that, since Rufus is not around, then she needs to release the poison, because that's all she can do at the moment. After that, she directed an attack at the monster. The frog slowly began to fall asleep, and so it continued until she took her last breath. Alraune sighed heavily as she watched this. Suddenly, she heard Ruth's worried voice coming from somewhere above. The girl's foot touched the ground, and immediately after that, she hugged Alraune tightly. Ruth hugged Alraune tightly to herself and thanked God that the girl was not injured in this battle. Iris blushed a little, looking at Ruth. Alraune felt extremely uncomfortable and quickly apologized for smearing the little witch with her slime earlier. Ruth gasped loudly and said it wasn't necessary. She thanked Alraune for saving her from the frog. The girl said that they would be able to find clean water later and the plant would be able to drink. Alraune was about to answer something when suddenly Ruff stopped her and added that if she had immediately turned into a bird, she would simply have become even more entangled in the Alraune vine. She said it was good that she thought about it. She stared at Alraune intently, then patted the girl on the head, which greatly embarrassed her. Iris began to ask about the reasons why Ruth did this. While they were talking, the girl suddenly heard someone's long-drawn scream. They stared at each other, trying to figure it out. Ruth asked Alraune if she had said something. The girl hesitated, then added that it wasn't her. Alraune's gaze quickly fell on the frog. She assumed that the monster might still be alive, and so she became very wary and looked at the monster, waiting for an attack. However, in the next moment, a small hand could be seen sticking out from under the frog's tongue. The little creature quickly fell out of the monster, completely covered in slime. Alraune and Ruth froze in amazement, watching what fell out of the frog. It was a little girl who had wings on her back. They assumed it was a fairy. The girl stretched out her hands with the bright liquid directly towards the little fairy who was lying unconscious. Ruff dripped some nectar into the fairy's mouth while Alraune silently watched from the sidelines. Suddenly, the fairy took a sip. She immediately flew into the air, where she coughed violently, after which she wondered if she was really saved. The fairy took a deep breath and said that she had already thought about dying there. Iris took a deep breath of relief. She was extremely glad that her nectar still worked, and the little fairy felt better. Alraune couldn't even think about how a fairy might be inside the frog. It seemed to her that she had released too much of that poisonous pollen into this monster. The little fairy came to her senses, then looked back and approached the face of Alraune, who was a little confused by this attention. The fairy asked the girls if they were the ones who saved her. Alraune quickly confirmed this, after which she asked the little girl about who she was. The fairy smiled broadly and said that her name was Keely. The fairy smiled proudly and closed her eyes, after which she said that she was just an incredible and stunning forest elf. The girls looked at her in disbelief after saying that she was stunning. Keely was amazed by their reaction and asked if they didn't think she was beautiful. The fairy exclaimed that they were too evil. Keely rose a little higher into the air, after which she began to swear at these smelly frogs because they made her all sticky now. The little fairy exclaimed that it was all because she was trying to save Alraune. Iris was very confused and looked at Keely, after which she asked what the little fairy meant by these words. Ruth was also watching the elf closely. Keely flew closer to them and asked how it was. She said that a talking plant and a flying girl were already too interesting and strange. She told the girls that she had been watching them since yesterday evening. Iris wondered if Keely was watching them. The fairy laughed and said that she had previously thought that they were both good, and she was glad that she was not mistaken in this at all. She said that they should be grateful to her, because she was the one who controlled the water level in the pond, and therefore pulled them out of that river. Keely took a deep breath and said that she had been absurdly eaten by a frog that was not far from them. This is exactly how it happened before. When Iris listened to everything, she smiled sweetly and thanked Keely for saving them. The fairy also said that they had done each other a favor, and now they are even. After that, Keely turned her gaze to Ruth and asked what concerned her. She asked what the little girl's name was, because she probably has a name. When the fairy spoke to her, Ruth blushed and looked away. Keely and Alraune just looked at the confused Ruth in silence, without commenting on it in any way. The fairy looked at the girls and asked what they were doing in this forest. Keely came to the conclusion that they lived in this thicket, after which she immediately exclaimed that this would not do, and it was too dangerous in this place. She said that if they were going to live there, they should go to the eastern part of the forest, where Keely lives. The fairy assured the girls that it was much safer there than here. Alraune thought about going east, but she was well aware that it would be no less dangerous to move through an area unknown to her. Alraune found herself thinking that it would be great if little Keely would help them and show them the way. As if hearing Alraune's thoughts, the fairy immediately exclaimed that everything was wrong, and she actually had a lot of things to do, and there was no time for them at all. However, Keely just couldn't help but comment on Iris's eyes. The fairy said admiringly that Alraune's eyes were the color of honey. Speaking of this, saliva began to flow from Keely's mouth, and her eyes burned brightly. Keely fell on her back, dreaming of the delicious nectar of Alraune. The girl also thought that if you give the fairies honey, you can get all the information she needs. Alraune smiled awkwardly, thinking that the list of those who are ready to lick her unconscious has been replenished again. Her nectar was just right for a contract with a fairy. Suddenly, she said that it was time for them to go. Keely turned to Ruth and asked the girl if she would fly. The fairy said that they could not just walk on the ground, and therefore Rufus would probably take Alraune with him. The witch was displeased, but she didn't say anything anyway. After a while, Ruth rose into the air, holding in her paws a small basket in which Alraune and Keely were hiding. Suddenly, a large shadow appeared directly above them, which blocked the rays of the sun. They were all at a loss. The guys raised their gaze a little higher into the sky, where they saw a huge eagle flying directly above them. Suddenly, the trajectory of the enemy bird quickly changed and headed straight at the guys. They were horrified to notice that he was attacking them. Alraune exclaimed that they urgently needed to escape. Upon hearing the screams, Ruth immediately looked up and saw the eagle, but she was well aware that they would not have time to dodge a possible attack on them. At that moment, while Ruth froze in the air, Alraune managed to launch her vines directly at the monster, which was rushing at them at full speed. They were the sprouts of cannibal flowers. These flowers rose higher and immediately began to spray some pollen. Alraune looked at it and thought that it was useless, because her pollen simply would not be enough for such a large bird. At that moment, when the grains of pollen hit the eagle's nose and he sneezed loudly, at the same time flapping his wings violently, just a flutter of his wings created a huge air wave that headed towards the forest. A strong shock wave carried Keely, Alraune, and Ruth into the bushes. The girls were amazed by what had happened. Keely stood up and praised the girl with a big smile because she was able to save them all. She said that it was just wonderful. After that, Keely climbed a little higher into the sky and talked about what kind of horrors they were in the middle of the day. She was amazed that they were almost caught. Suddenly, she remembered that there is a river nearby, and she wants to finally get rid of the slime. Alraune looked at the fairy and said that she had recently seen this big eagle. Keely said that this bird is always watching the forest, and therefore they should be careful. Alraune also asked why, then, this bird attacked them, because they had done nothing wrong. Keely smiled, then said she didn't know. She assumed that this eagle was just hungry, so it attacked. Alraune immediately noticed that Keely's manner of speech was strange. Before meeting her, she and Ruth were alone, and no one attacked them, so she did not understand the reason for the attack this time. Keely said she was accidentally eaten by a frog, but Iris had her doubts. The girl gasped, assuming that the fairies were delicious. Immediately, Alraune convinced herself that she wasn't eating fairies. They took a few more steps and found themselves in place. Keely talked about how clean the water was. Together, the girls swam in a clear river and enjoyed communicating with each other. They came to a large rock where Keely advised the girls to settle down. That way, they had at least some advantage. She said that if they have problems, they should be fixed. The fairy said she had some things to do, so she had to leave, but she would definitely come back later to check on the others. She said goodbye to them. Alraune and Ruth watched in silence as the little fairy walked further away. At one point, Iris noticed that the witch's expression was extremely displeased. Ruth said she didn't trust this fairy. The girl told that one day a traveler came to her village who told that fairies always deceive people. She assumed that even now, Keely had gone to warn her own people in order to catch them. Ruth had said firmly that Keely was dangerous, and she was convinced that the fairy might well betray them. Iris said nothing. She didn't know why Ruth couldn't trust her. The witch said that fairies look like people. They may be partly monsters, but they still behave like people. That's why Ruth didn't trust them. Alraune asked what about her. Ruth went down and said that Alraune is a monster, and moreover, she is a plant, so the witch feels safe. She smiled. Alraune stared at her in silence. Suddenly, Ruth said that she was hungry and really wanted honey. Iris stopped her immediately. She said they should go to the river and catch a lot of fish. She stood by the river and thought that she needed to get a proper meal for Ruth. She was like an older sister, and therefore she had to do everything in her power. Fish were swimming by in the river, and Alraune quickly folded her arms to start attacking. When the fish was close enough, Alraune lifted her vines and quickly fished the creature out of the water. So she gathered a lot of fish and brought it to Rufus with pride. The girl tensed up and asked what would happen to them if this fish was poisoned. Iris thought that if the fish was no good, then they could catch someone else, and this time they would do without poison. She picked up her vine and said that the monsters should go straight to her, because she has very tasty nectar. As if at her call, a variety of animals began to come out of the forest. Squirrels appeared, and even a small deer came forward. They all started drinking nectar from the all-round vines. The girl was glad, thinking that nectar attracts animals. The next moment, she quickly killed the animals and called Ruth to her, because now they have meat. Ruth was amazed. The girl quietly said that she did not like raw meat. She lifted the squirrel's body. Alraune said that, in that case, she would eat it. Ruth agreed and said that she would have enough apple and nectar for now. After that, she happily started eating an apple. Alraune panicked and wondered what to do, because she and Ruth ate completely differently. Alraune took a wand and a board, then tried to light a fire. She tried to use everything she remembers to build a fire. She thought she should have read survival books when she was in school. Then she looked at Ruth, who was licking her finger. She wondered what they should do if she was a plant and Rufus was a human and they couldn't live together at all. The witch noticed Alraune's gaze on her, after which she immediately turned away and blushed. Iris thought that she should make every effort so that they could live together. However, the next day, something happened that Alraune was so afraid of. Iris looked at Ruth and asked what was wrong with her. The witch's entire face was red and she was breathing heavily. Alraune looked at Ruth with an agitated expression on her face and loudly called out the girl's name. Ruth was sitting with a reddened face. The girl put her vines to the girl's forehead. Iris looked at her, thinking that Ruth had a fever. Alraune reflected that it was not for nothing that she thought that apples and honey alone would not be enough. She suggested that it might be exhaustion. However, there is no doctor nearby. The girl needed proper nutrition and medical care. Iris thought desperately about how she would like to go to the city. The girl hated her body, calling it an ugly fruit. At that moment, footsteps were heard in the forest. This noise attracted the attention of Alraune, who immediately raised her head. The girl began to quickly look around while a monster was looking at her in the bushes nearby. The monster quickly hid behind a tree, but looked out anyway. Alraune looked closer and realized that it was Trent, the tree monster. The girl was at a loss because she did not understand what he wanted. She assumed he might have come just to look at them. Alraune watched Trent run quickly from one place to another. She thought it was the right thing to do. The monster should escape from this place. She thought about how jealous she was that he had legs. A brilliant idea came to the girl. She began to think that if she ate Trent, she would be able to walk. She imagined how she would move on small legs. Suddenly, Trent started running. He quickly headed towards the girls who were caught off guard. At that moment, Mealy joyfully called out to the girls, informing them that she had returned. She waved at them. The forest fairy was sitting on Trent's head, who stopped next to them. Iris looked at Keely in surprise. Keely took off, saying that she had returned earlier than she thought. The fairy said that she was fine, after which she hesitated slightly. The fairy drew attention to the alarmed Alraune and the sick Rufus. Keely confusedly uttered the words that it seemed that they were not doing very well. Alraune awkwardly called out to Keely, who did not understand what had happened. The fairy sighed understandingly, telling them to relax because this monster is not their enemy. The fairy said that she met him on the way. Keely assumed Trent was a fan of Iris. Alraune looked at the frightened monster in confusion, wondering if he was really her fan. The girl thought it was interesting, of course, but she was worried about Ruth. Iris turned to Keely, asking the fairy if she could help her get into the city. Keely was surprised to clarify the girl's words. The fairy replied with a categorical refusal, saying that it was dangerous. She asked if the girl understood that. Iris replied that they needed food and medicine. Alraune drooped, so Keely looked at her carefully, as did Trent, who was next to her. The fairy said the words that they need to go to the forest sanctuary. She said that you can find the hostess there and ask her for help. Alraune thought about the sanctuary and the mistress. The girl asked Keely if this hostess would help them. Keely replied that she would certainly help. She said that she already wanted to introduce them, and now is just the right moment. Iris asked if it was true. The girl sighed with relief, looking at Ruth. She asked the girl to wait a little longer. Alraune started talking about how they had to get to this forest sanctuary, after which she turned her gaze to Trent, who stood uncertainly next to her. The girl wanted to ask a question about Trent, but the fairy interrupted her, answering in the negative. She said it was useless because he didn't understand anything. Keely said that she had heard that the monster had known the girl since she was big and lived in another place. He admired the beauty of the girl and sometimes spied on her from afar. Iris looked at him in surprise, wondering if this was serious. Trent quickly started to brush it off, and the fairy added words that it was before that part of the forest burned down. Keely said that as the girl sees, he can walk, so he managed to survive that fire. However, he was constantly worried about leaving Alraune on fire because she couldn't move on her own. The fairy said that this was the reason he wanted to see her again, to make amends. She said that right now he wants to become her child to help her. The girl exclaimed questioningly, and the fairy answered in the affirmative, saying that he was ready for anything. She said Trent was so generous to be so worried about him. Alraune thought that he didn't need to feel guilty because they didn't even know each other. They also don't owe each other anything at all. After that, we set off. Alraune wrapped her vine around Trent to grab on. The monster itself picked up Rufus, and Keely flew next to him. Iris awkwardly thought that they were in a difficult situation right now, so she would become his mother. Trent was carrying a sick Rufe in his arms, and Iris was watching them from behind. Alraune called out to Keely and asked what kind of mistress of the forest she was. The fairy thought about it. Keely replied with a smile that the hostess was very scary, because she was the spirit of the forest after all. The girl was very scared by what she heard. She didn't know that the mistress was a spirit. The girl hoped that the hostess was not so scary. Iris reflected that she hadn't even thought about whether she would even want to help Ruth. The girl was thinking how everything would go, and suddenly someone appeared next to her. A huge bear appeared next to the group of monsters, which was passing by. Iris looked at him in shock. She couldn't believe it was this bear again, and they were bumping into each other again. She was thinking that she was too young to handle him right now. The girl was wondering what to do. At that moment, Keely flew up to the huge bear, who thanked him for guarding the sanctuary. After that, the bear turned around and headed away, passing by Alraune, Ruth, and Trent. Keely looked at the girl, telling her not to be afraid, because bears are the guardians of the sanctuary. Iris looked at him in surprise. A few moments later, the guys were left alone in the forest. Iris looked at the fairy, who said with a smile that they were following her. After that, the guys set off again on the path that the fairy pointed out to them. Keely, with a smile on her face, called out to Lady Dryad, informing her that she had returned. At the same time, Alraune looked in front of her with delight, her big eyes wide open. They had a view of the depths of the forest, which was very calm and beautiful to look at. A girl with her eyes covered appeared next to a large tree. It was the spirit of the forest, the Dryad. Alraune thought that she also knew this name because they were legendary in books and legends. The Dryad started talking about what Keely had told her about Alraune and her friend. Iris released Trent and looked at the Dryad. The spirit of the forest also uttered the words that it was a strange Alraune and a witch girl who appeared in this forest. The Dryad said that she would like to talk to the witch, but she seems to be ill. The girl sighed thoughtfully, after which she said that the girl seemed exhausted. At that moment, Alraune turned to the Dryad with a request for help. The vines that were part of the forest spirit's hair began to move. One of the vines rose, and the girl presented it to her lips, which caused a small bud to appear in this place. The bud blossomed quickly, and a small flower appeared in its place. The vine with it approached the girl. Liquid began to stand out from the flower, which fell into Rufus's mouth in a small droplet. Alraune and Trent watched what was happening carefully. Suddenly, Ruth felt much better. Her fever subsided and she relaxed. Iris was very happy when she saw it. The Dryad told the girl that she had given the girl a piece of her life force, which shocked Alraune. The forest spirit said that now the girl needs to be fed. She said her fairies would take care of it. At this moment, a large number of small fairies quickly headed towards the Dryad. Alraune watched them with admiration. Alraune thought about how many fairies there were. The girl was wondering where they were going. The spirit informed that tomorrow they will cure the girl. The Dryad asked Iris if she would mind spending the night in this place, which puzzled her. The spirit of the forest spoke the words that the girl should not be afraid, because this is a women's temple, so there is no one here who could harm her. Iris was surprised that it was a women's temple. She suddenly realized that the Trents who live in this place are also girls. Alraune looked at Trent happily, thinking that she had unknowingly become her older sister. At that moment, Alraune was hailed. The Dryad said that now Alraune must do something for the spirit of the forest. The girl sighed in disbelief, suggesting that it might be a wish. She confusedly asked the girl what she wanted. The Dryad replied that it was very simple. Alraune would protect the spirit of the forest. The girl said that if the enemy came to this forest, Iris would fight in her place. The Dryad was talking about what Keeley had told her about how strong Alraune was. She said that, in addition, she sees a very powerful light inside her. It was a strong spirit. The girl said the words that Alraune must be special. Alraune looked at the spirit of the forest with a surprised expression, then sighed thoughtfully. The Dryad said the words that she would give Alraune until tomorrow so that she could think about it. After that, the guests of the forest sanctuary went to sleep. Alraune thought that this girl was beautiful. She was thinking that it really was a spirit. She thought about the Dryad. She said that even though she looks like a human, she's actually an old tree. Iris wondered if this huge tree was her true identity. Alraune thought that she, like the Dryad, was both a plant and a human at the same time. She decided that it didn't matter what she had to do, because Ruth had saved the spirit, so she could trust her. The girl looked around and thought that the ground level in this place was unnaturally high. She couldn't understand why it had happened. Trent, covered by a small leaf, shuddered and looked away. Alraune was sitting next to him, looking at something intently. There was a small object in front of the girl. The girl looked closer and realized that it was a helmet, and a stone slab was closed next to it. Alraune froze in shock in front of the object she found. There was a single phrase carved on a battered, moss-covered tombstone. On the stone slab it was said that the hero rests in this place. Ruth was lying with her eyes closed and breathing heavily. She thought that she was so cold inside, but her body was burning. The witch thought that she was the girl's sister, so she had to keep an eye on her. A voice rang out, asking for help. After that, Ruth opened her eyes. She was lying on the grass in the morning sun. The girl sat down in surprise and began to look around. She was sitting in the middle of the forest. Ruth got to her feet. Alraune was surrounded by an abundance of food. The Dryad said that the fairies had worked hard to get it all. The girl is lucky that fairies are very good when it comes to stealth. Iris wondered in shock if the fairies had really stolen all this from someone. Alraune thought that maybe she cared where it came from, but Ruth's health was still a priority right now, so she thought it was better to forget about it for now. The Dryad said that she would give them all these products so the girl would not have to worry about nutrition in the near future. Iris thanked the spirit of the forest for this. The spirit of the forest began to talk about something else. By this point, Ruth had begun to approach them. The girl saw Alraune and the Dryad not far away. She raised her hand to call out to the girl, but did not have time. The Dryad said that she thought it would not be easy for the girl to live with Alraune in the forest. These words greatly shocked the girl. The forest spirit continued to say that it is better for a human child to live in the city. Alraune tried to contradict the girl. She said that, as the Dryad knows, Rufus is a witch. The girl replied that there are many witches living among people. The Dryad said that if she didn't like living among ordinary people, there were villages where only witches lived. In any case, the forest is not a place for people, and it would be much better and more comfortable for the girl to live with people. Ruth, hearing these words, quickly became gloomy and very upset. She turned around and walked away. Alraune thought deeply. At that moment, the Dryad asked if the girl could now answer her question from yesterday. Alraune assumed that the girl meant fighting for her. The Dryad confirmed her guess. Iris thought about how it turned out that she would have to protect the Dryad even without her request. She didn't think it would change anything, so perhaps Iris was ready to become a kind of bouncer, especially since she owed the spirit and had to pay her. Alraune replied to the girl that she agreed. The Dryad said the words that it was wonderful. She said she was looking forward to seeing the girl in action. Iris looked at the spirit carefully, then called out her name. The girl began to talk about the fact that there in the forest she saw a strange stone buried in the ground. Iris asked what kind of stone it was. The Dryad replied that it was the tombstone of someone who lost his life in the forest, the grave of a man. Alraune was surprised to clarify the girl's words. The Dryad confirmed her words, saying that this is an ordinary human grave. Alraune wondered if it could be the grave of the hero, her fiancé. She thought she might have heard something from that boy. Alraune suggested that perhaps this is the grave of the previous hero. She remembered that her grandfather had told her that about 50 years ago, the hero fought with the army of the Demon King. Iris wondered if the Dryad had fought with him and left him to die. However, she had no reason to mourn him then, and besides, she had a strange expression on her face. After that, the girl was lost in her thoughts for a long time. Suddenly, Keely flew up to the girl and called her name. The fairy asked if the girl understood that the witch was alive because of her. She asked what the girl thought about thanking her. Alraune thought about gratitude. The fairy, on the other hand, looked at the girl with a satisfied face, waiting. At that moment, Keely quickly opened the girl's mouth with her hands, wishing herself a pleasant appetite. Alraune was very confused by this, so she began to wave her arms violently. The fairy was sitting in her mouth. A few moments later, Keely got out. She was smeared all over with nectar. The fairy sighed contentedly, saying that the nectar of Alraune is simply incredible. Keely quite exclaimed the words that from now on she would be a fairy girl. She asked if Keely the flower fairy sounded good. Alraune asked, confused, if the fairy was sure of this, because she served the Dryad. The fairy waved her hand in a relaxed manner, saying that the Dryad could handle everything calmly without her. Suddenly, Iris was called by name. The girl turned around and looked at the girl. She thought that maybe Ruth wanted honey too. Alraune called out to Ruth, saying that the Dryad had gotten her food. At that moment, the girl uttered the words that she would not live in the city. This statement made Alraune freeze and sigh in disbelief. The girl sat down next to him on the grass. Ruth grabbed the food that the fairies had obtained and began to eat it quickly. She ate everything that was there. The girl said that she heard the girl talking to the spirit of the forest, and how she said she shouldn't live here. The girl exclaimed the words that she actually hates people. She talked sadly about wanting to be with a girl. Ruth hid behind the food while Alraune looked at the girl sadly. Iris called Keely's name, after which Trent went somewhere. After a while, Keely appeared with a sprout. She exclaimed the words of what she had found. The fairy asked if it would be suitable. Alraune answered in the affirmative, thinking that this unusual plant looks like eucalyptus. Eucalyptus leaves contain a volatile, highly flammable substance. In case of dryness or high temperature, it can ignite even from a spark. This is the reason why fires are common in Australia, famous for its eucalyptus trees. Alraune was thinking that eucalyptus is also called a gasoline tree. The girl looked at him and thought about it. Alraune thought that they would catch fire at a temperature of 40 degrees, but it's spring now. There was clearly not enough sun, and the girl could withstand no more than 20 degrees of heat. However, according to her school memories, there are plants that can tolerate temperatures up to 40 degrees. She thought that she was not only a plant, but also a monster, so Iris had to deal with it. While the girl was lost in her thoughts, Ruth was watching her. The girl turned to Alraune with a question about what she was doing. The girl told Ruth to watch her build a fire. This made the girl sigh in disbelief. The girl said with a smile that she would cook a hot meal for Ruth. The girl looked at her in surprise. Alraune stretched out her vines, at the ends of which leaves formed. The girl closed her eyes and concentrated. The leaves slowly began to smoke. At that moment, the girl's leaves began to light up, which greatly surprised Alraune herself. Ruth opened her mouth in shock, and Alraune suddenly began to scream loudly. Ruth rushed to the girl, shouting her name. They began to scatter the leaves, shouting that it should be removed. Alraune thought that she had been so engrossed in making a fire that she had forgotten about the consequences. The fire is so strong that it can spread to the fruit. The girl thought that in this case it would be better to separate the burning part. The girl decided that she would take advantage of the peculiarity of the eucalyptus, which she had just eaten. Eucalyptus trees are flammable, so they have built-in fire protection. The outer part of the bark is easily ignited, and the inner part almost does not burn. If the eucalyptus catches fire, then the outer part of the bark can be torn off, thereby preventing the spread of fire. Alraune thought that now all she had to do was to throw off the burning part of the vine. It was like peeling the bark. The leaves on the tips of the vine fell down, and the girl smiled happily. She thoughtfully began to examine the vines, thinking that it looked like there would be burns. By this time, Ruth ran up to her, who called out the girl's name. Keely flew up to Iris, who apologized to the girl, saying that she was very scared, so she tried to put out the girl with anything. She excitedly asked if she was okay. Alraune looked at the trash that was lying nearby and noticed something. The vines stirred. The girl waved at Keely and Ruth, telling them to step back a little. This made them look at her in disbelief. Quite by chance, Alraune noticed the lithops. It belongs to the family of littoral grasses. This plant imitates the shape of a pebble. This is one of his unique abilities. It sounds interesting, of course, but the girl was not interested in something else right now. Another feature of it, namely molting. From this, Alraune joyfully spread her arms out to the sides and smiled broadly. The girl was very pleased with her find. Her face was sparkling with happiness and contentment. After a while, they were roasting food on a small fire. The girl said the words about how delicious it was. Besides, she warmed up so well from the inside. Alraune told the girl to eat her fill. Ruth agreed with her. The girl turned to Alraune, saying that the girl was amazing because, being a plant, she made fire with such ease. Ruth suddenly became thoughtful, and her face became slightly sad. She started saying something about herself. The girl remembered the past and how she was treated then. She was very sad about it. There were tears on the girl's face then. The girl said the words that she does not like people. Suddenly, Ruth got to her feet and exclaimed the words of what she had decided. She stood in front of Alraune and Trent, talking about going shopping in the city. Alraune looked at Ruth with a little surprise, and the girl said that the food that the girl cooked on the fire was very tasty, but she wanted something else. Ruth said that if she didn't have proper food, she would get sick again, and if she gets sick again, she will give the girl a lot of trouble again. Ruth said that even though she doesn't like people, as a human, she needs some things created by other people to survive in the forest. She said that for this reason, she would go to the city to earn money. The girl came closer to Alraune, who was looking at her intently. Alraune tried to contradict the girl. However, Ruth interrupted her. She exclaimed with confidence that it was all for the sake of always living with a girl. Ruth asked if Alraune understood everything. After that, the girl fell silent and smiled slightly, looking warmly at the girl in front of her. Alraune anxiously asked Ruth about how she would earn money. To this, the witch replied that everything was fine. Ruth sat down in front of Alraune and said with a smile that she had a great idea. Some time passed after the girl's conversation. Slowly, it began to dawn. Ruth turned around and said she would be back soon. The girl grabbed a bucket in her hands and waved happily at Alraune. The girl was shocked to think that really Ruth decided to go to the city to sell her nectar there. A joyful Ruth, holding a bucket filled with Alraune nectar in her hands, went to the city. The girl informed Alraune that she was going shopping in the city. She said people disgusted her, but Ruth herself is a human being. In order to live in the forest, she needs something. For this reason, Ruth decided to go to the city. Alraune asked about how the girl would earn money. Ruth replied so that she wouldn't worry. Ruth, with an enthusiastic expression on her face, said that she had a great idea. She said she was going to sell Alraune nectar. At that moment, a loud shout rang out throughout the neighborhood. The girl could not believe what she had heard. After that, Alraune began collecting nectar in a bucket while Keely watched her. The fairy rushed forward with joyful cries, saying that she could not control herself because there was a honey bath in front of her. However, Keely was quickly caught by her small wings, which caused the fairy to start screaming to be released. The girl told her that this nectar was for sale. Ruth wanted to eat it herself, but she held on. Alraune was mentally asking for help. The girl excitedly uttered the words that this is all, and she can no longer. Ruth asked Alraune to try, to which the girl replied that it would not work in any way. Trent happily jumped up and down beside her, and the fairy asked where she had been. There was something lying on the grass on the big leaves. Trent began to diligently roll up the contents into a bundle. Keely told me that Trent said she was looking for a snack for her on the road. She praised the monster, saying she was smart. After that, Ruth announced that she would probably go. She asked the girl if she could handle it on her own. Alraune answered in the affirmative. The witch told the girl not to worry, because she would definitely sell the nectar. Alraune turned to Ruth, telling her to take care of herself and come back as soon as possible. Ruth replied that everything was fine. The girl said she would be careful so they wouldn't find out she was a witch. She said that if something happened, Rufus would turn into a bird and fly away. Alraune agreed. After that, the girl left. Alraune waved at her with a smile, thinking that it was a little awkward that the girl was going to sell her bodily fluids. However, there was nothing to be done about it. Since Ruth made it all up on her own, Alraune has to support her like an older sister. The girl hoped that she would meet kind people. Alraune, smiling sweetly after the girl, closed her eyes. This caused her face to blush slightly. The girl suddenly thought that it was Ruth who suggested using her bucket for nectar. So Alraune agreed, and the girl went to the city, taking with her the bucket in which Alraune took root. Alraune thought that, in other words, her houseplant life had come to an end. The girl thought with a smile that she was a monster plant, Alraune, and now she's finally grown out of the bucket. Alraune reflected that when she puts down roots in the ground, the sensations are completely different. This way, it is much better saturated with moisture. She thought that at this rate, she would soon become big. After a while, the girl reached a small town. Quite a few people were walking down the street, passing by grocery stores. There was a girl standing among the people, on the street. She awkwardly tried to call a girl who was passing by, to no avail. The shopping street was noisy, and people were walking in different directions from one counter to another. Ruth walked slowly down the street, holding her bucket in her hands. She looked pretty tired. She sighed heavily. The girl reflected that she could not sell nectar, and at the same time avoid crowded places. However, there was a chance that someone from the crowd might recognize her as a witch. At that moment, someone noticed this whiteness. The stranger was thinking that even though there are a lot of people here, no one has such hair. Ruth stopped under a small archway and decided to eat. She noticed that if you dip bread in nectar, it will be very tasty. The girl suddenly shook her head, thinking that this would be enough. She thought that she should sell it and earn a lot of money because that's the only way she can always be with Alraune. While Ruth sat under the arch and rested. Nearby in the building, someone thanked the girl for the treat, saying that they could not believe that the saint herself honored them with her presence. The girl replied that there was no need for formalities because she was not a saint. The girl bowed politely, saying that her name was Nina and she was a disciple of the saint. The woman replied with a smile that even a student is a respected person for the townspeople. Nina said that she had just arrived in this city and it was very quiet here. She couldn't believe that someone was stealing groceries in this area. The woman agreed, saying that it was strange that no one noticed. That's why everyone was discussing fairies. Nina suddenly realized something. She remembered that there was a Dryad forest not far from this place. She was thinking that they said in the church that evil spirits lived there. The girl suggested that there might be fairies there then. At that moment, the woman said the words that, however, it was not so important. She didn't want to upset the spirits and make too much noise. Nina looked at her questioningly, asking what she meant. Suddenly, the food that was being cooked on the fire began to boil. The woman cursed and apologized, saying that she needed to go to the pot. Nina replied that it was her fault. The girl apologized for disturbing the woman while she was cooking. After that, Nina left the house and went outside, where she saw something. She was looking at the man who was sitting under the archway. The girl walked up to Ruth and turned around to look at her. The witch asked gloomily if she needed anything. Ruth quickly pulled up her hood, and Nina awkwardly apologized, saying that she had seen the girl here before. Nina said that the girl was sitting, and she wondered if something had happened. She looked at Ruth in confusion and asked if she could help the girl. The witch turned away, saying that she was fine. The girl said she just sat down to rest for a while. Nina looked at her in surprise, then approached and asked if it was nectar. Ruth stood up abruptly, and Nina asked if the girl was selling it, and if she was alone here. The student asked the girl if anyone else had come with her. At that moment, Ruth exclaimed that she was not alone. Ruth replied to the girl that she had a sister. The witch told me that she was 1 year old and couldn't move because something had happened to her legs. For this reason, the girl has to work. She confidently said that she was her older sister and always wanted to be with her. Nina suddenly took out a bag. The saint's disciple handed Ruth a small bag and enthusiastically asked her to sell all the nectar. Ruth looked back at her in surprise. The witch awkwardly asked to wait because she had nothing to pour the nectar into. Nina reacted quickly, telling the girl to wait here, and she will come now. Nina brought a large jug. She said the words that he would definitely fit in here. Ruth sighed awkwardly and asked if the girl really wanted to buy everything. Nina replied that she had a man whom she respected, and so the girl was sure that he would have done the same for her. And Nina loves sweets, so Ruth doesn't have to worry. She said she would find a use for it. The saint's disciple tasted the nectar with a smile, saying how delicious it was. She said she would eat everything right now. After that, Ruth left the girl. Nina looked at the girl and wondered if she was doing everything right. She asked Iris to look after her. Pupil Iris lowered her head and thought that she seemed too emotional. She thought that she could feel the light aura of Iris from this nectar. Besides, he smelled incredibly delicious. The girl understood that this was bad manners. However, she only wanted to lick him lightly. Meanwhile, Alraune was waiting for Ruth in the forest. Alraune stood in the middle of the forest sanctuary, and Trent stood next to her. At that moment, Alraune was loudly called by name. Ruth ran out to meet the girl, who raised an empty bucket over her head with a joyful expression on her face. In the evening, Ruth began to talk about how one girl bought all the nectar from her. Alraune was surprised to find out if she had taken all the nectar. The girl answered in the affirmative. Ruth joyfully handed the girl a bag with the words that she had given her all her purse. Suddenly, Ruth realized something. She assumed that Alraune had never seen money before. She said that these little circles inside are money. Alraune looked at the bag, thinking that it was a very thin cloth purse. It was similar to the ones given out in the church when she was a saint. The girl suddenly realized that it was a long time ago. She had to learn magic, clean the cathedral, attend lectures, do physical education, practice combat exercises, treat the wounded who came to church. The girl sighed heavily from this. She remembers that, when she was a saint, she comforted a student who was crying because of the difficulty of learning. It's been about 5 years since then. Alraune hoped that Nina was doing well. Alraune looked warmly at the purse in her hands. Ruth said she had a gift for Alraune, but she shouldn't use it all at once. The girl handed the bag to the girl, saying that this fertilizer is a very useful food for plants. Alraune silently looked at him and then thanked Ruth. Alraune was looking at the fertilizer carefully, so Ruth asked if it was salty. The girl awkwardly replied that everything was wrong. She thought that the girl had just reminded Alraune again that she was a plant. Ruth looked at the girl with a caring smile, saying that she would grow up quickly this way. After that, she added the words that Alraune would be able to produce even more nectar this way. Alraune smiled awkwardly, thinking that if it was for Ruth's sake, then she, as an older sister, was ready to sell a part of herself. The little fairy quickly flew past Alraune and headed on. The girl called out Keely's name. Alraune asked the fairy if she had come to them with Ruth at night. Keely was surprised to ask what the girl was talking about. The girl sighed thoughtfully and thought that she had seen this light the night before Fertfrosh attacked them. However, Keely was in his stomach at the time. Because of the glow, it looked like fairies were flying nearby. For this reason, Alraune thought that maybe it was Keely who secretly came to them. The girl waved away the fairy's question. The girl assumed that it was just her imagination. At that moment, Alraune called out to Ruth. The girl asked her how she liked these fertilizers. Iris replied with a smile that she liked it very much. Ruth exclaimed that it was wonderful. The girl happily asked how about giving her some nectar. Alraune agreed, confused. After that, Ruth quickly went back with the bucket. Alraune thought that now, while Ruth was in town selling nectar, she would have time to feast on various plants and improve her abilities. The girl noticed the fact that she had not been here yet. She was sure there would be a lot of new plants here. By this point, Trent had brought a large pile of different plants. Keely said that they didn't know what the girl liked, so they just took everything they could find. She said the words about how tired she was. Iris thanked them for their help and then looked at the plants, stretching out her vines to them. Keely asked the girl if these plants would be suitable, to which Alraune replied in the affirmative. The girl said that this plant is called tepary. She said that this round part is filled with seeds and juice. The girl said that when it comes off, the seeds and juice fly out of the hole, as in an explosion. Iris suggested that maybe she could use it as a weapon. Keely sighed thoughtfully, saying that she had thought of something. The forest fairy asked Alraune how she knew so much about plants, and she also gets the abilities of those plants that she ate. Keely said she had never heard of such a thing. Iris put the plant in her mouth to eat. A growth appeared at the end of the vine, and the girl thought that now she could make them big. She quickly unhooked it and threw it away to the side. Keely exclaimed that he had flown well. Alraune didn't think it could be considered a weapon. She decided that it needed to be improved somehow. The girl thought about the fact that, in any case, her main goal is tahina. Tahina is one of the largest palm trees, the trunk of which can grow up to 18 meters in height. It is believed that the lifespan of this fish reaches 50 years. In one bloom, it consumes all its nutrients, after which it dies. It is also called a palm tree that self-destructs because of the way it dies. Alraune was thinking that she could use this for some kind of experiment. Her hypothesis was that with her help, she would be able to create children for herself. The girl thought that most likely the concept of clones would be more appropriate here. When the fire broke out, she created a flower with her own male genetic material. Then she pollinated the pistil with it and received the seed. She was wondering what would happen if she planted a male and female flower with her genes on a vine and allowed them to pollinate. This can be called reproduction in its usual form. To be more precise, it is a necessary reproduction. In any case, this is a normal phenomenon for plants. However, it seemed to Iris that Rufus would be very surprised. After all, it's just an experiment. She felt sorry for the child she would create in this way. The only problem is the lower body. It would be a disaster if someone took it away and misused it. That's where Tahina's ability comes in handy. When the child self-pollinates, the ability of the tahini will cause part of the bulb to completely die off. Thus, there will be nothing left but the seed. Alraune thought that it was a little scary, but it was useful to know the limits of your abilities. Trent deftly lifted a large stem with her hands so that the girl could absorb it. After that, large flowers began to grow at the ends of the Alraune vine. The girl looked at them attentively. One flower began to pollinate gradually, after which their petals began to crumble. A small bud appeared in their place. Alraune cast a recovery spell on him. She inhaled in surprise, thinking that she had already sprouted. Suddenly, someone's voice rang out. A new little flower monster appeared in front of the girl, which was very similar to the girl herself. Alraune looked at her in surprise. The two Alraunes looked at each other while Trent was nearby. Iris greeted the new Alraune, to which she received a slow greeting in response. The child called the girl Mom, which greatly surprised Alraune. Alraune thought about how she seemed to be able to communicate. The girl asked the child who Iris was in a previous life. Alraune replied that she was a saint, and before that, a schoolgirl. The girl came to the conclusion that they have common memories. She quickly summoned her vine to embrace the girl. However, she pushed her away. Iris asked the child if she had inherited any of her abilities. Little Alraune replied that it was possible, but not everything, because she was still weak. The girl uttered the words that she is only a part of her mother. For this reason, it cannot be completely identical to it. Alraune thought that it turns out that the girl is only a part of her alter ego. Iris looked at the child, thinking that this is what she looked like when she was little. It was the first time she had seen herself from the outside. At that moment, little Alraune uttered the words that it was time for her to return. She said that this was an experiment, so we can end this. After that, a flower appeared. Little Alraune said that Mom needed to eat her seed and she would come back. The girl swallowed the flower. After that, her body suddenly began to grow rapidly. Little Alraune's belly became huge, after which changes began to occur. There are remains on the ground. A small seed appeared from the remains of the girl's body. Iris was shocked to think that she had just seen her reproduce. The girl looked at the remains, thinking that she should probably eat the seed. It seemed to her that her alter ego wanted this. Alraune put the seed in her mouth, after which she began to see images with little Alraune. She realized that she was her. Alraune thought that she seemed to have gained the memory of a little girl by eating the seed. It's amazing that a girl can do that. Her abilities scared the girl a little. She thought she was tired somehow. She needed to eat something from what Trent had brought and regain her strength. She can just relax in the sun. After some time, Ruth came, who joyfully called Alraune. She reported that she returned with an empty bucket in her hands. The girl noticed that she was quite early. Ruth happily told me that the girl's honey is instantly sold out. Ruth asked what the girl was doing, then stopped and sighed questioningly. The witch turned to Alraune with the question of whether the girl had grown up. Iris replied in the affirmative. Alraune realized that this girl had bought everything again. Ruth happily said that she was just lucky, but she was glad to meet her. It was great that Ruth was able to sell everything quickly, but something was wrong. A girl couldn't eat all the honey at once. At that moment, Ruth remembered something. She said that she had something for the girl, showing her a vegetable. Alraune quickly absorbed the fruit. after which shoots began to grow on her vine. She took root in the ground. The root crops began to ripen quickly. Ruth began to pull them out of the ground, harvesting them. The girl said that if she had a pot or a frying pan, she would easily cook everything. There was nothing difficult about it. Put it on the fire, cover with a lid, and simmer until tender. She thought beans and turnips would burn if cooked over an open fire. Ruth didn't know what to do. She suddenly came up with something. The girl wrapped the vegetables in leaves and poisoned them by the fire. The witch said that when they built a big fire in their village, they buried vegetables in the ashes. That's how they prepared, even though it took a long time. In general, they could be eaten raw. Iris was happy with the idea. The only cooking method that comes to Iris's mind is to bake them whole. In her previous life, she was a duchess and never cooked. She was completely sure that Ruth was a better cook than she was. The witch said that as soon as she saved up money, she would immediately buy a pot. With her, she would just be able to get water in the city, and then they wouldn't have to worry about it. The girl looked at Alraune with a smile. After a while, the fire next to him went out. Ruth asked the girl where Trent and the fairy were. Alraune replied that Keely said she was going to the Dryad, and she took Trent with her. Ruth suddenly turned to the girl, saying that there were rumors about the Dryad in the city. The girl looked at Alraune, telling her that once a Dryad killed a hero. Ruth said she hates people. She didn't care which side they were on. Even though the Dryad and the fairy had helped them, the girl couldn't trust them. After a while, it was the dead of night. Alraune wrapped Rufus in her vines. Alraune wondered if the Dryad had killed the last hero. It turns out that she helped them because she believed that they were not on the side of people, and Iris also agreed to protect her. However, she may want Iris to fight humans. Alraune thought that she would need to talk to Keely tomorrow when she arrived. In the meantime, she decided to sleep.